Hello everyone, and welcome back to Aged Tales. Tonight I have 9 chilling stories for you. Fictional tales crafted to help you drift off while the rain falls softly in the background. These are stories about secrets buried deep, about the weight of memory, and about the thin places where the past refuses to stay dead. So settle in, get comfortable under your blankets, and let the sound of rain wash over you as we begin this evening's journey into the dark and the strange. Let's begin. Story 1. The apartment had good bones, the realtor said, which Michael Reeves would later understand was code for everything else about it is questionable. It occupied the 3rd floor of a converted textile mill in a small New Hampshire town, all exposed brick and timber beams that groaned when the wind picked up. The rent was half what he'd been paying in Boston, which mattered more than aesthetics after the divorce cleaned out his savings. He moved in on a Tuesday in late October, carrying boxes up 3 flights of narrow stairs, while leaves the color of rust tumbled past the windows. The previous tenant had left behind a few things: a standing mirror in the bedroom, some wire hangers in the closet, and a smell in the bathroom that no amount of bleach seemed to address. Michael told himself these were minor inconveniences, the price of affordable living. He was 42, starting over, and in no position to be particular. The first week passed in the predictable chaos of unpacking and establishing routines. He worked from home now, technical writing for a pharmaceutical company, which meant long days at his desk staring at the brick wall and wondering if this isolation was freedom or just another kind of prison. The building was mostly empty. The ground floor held a yoga studio that seemed perpetually closed, and he'd glimpsed one other resident, an elderly woman who moved slowly down the hallway with a walker, never making eye contact. The mirror bothered him, though he couldn't articulate why. It was full-length, ornate frame, probably worth keeping, but something about it felt intrusive. It stood in the bedroom corner, angled so that it caught him in peripheral vision whenever he passed. More than once, he'd startled at his own reflection, mistaking it for someone else in the room. After the 4th or 5th time, he turned it to face the wall. But that felt worse somehow, like giving a time out to an object that hadn't done anything wrong. He turned it back. The sounds started on his 9th night in the apartment. Michael woke at 3:17 a.m. to footsteps in the hallway outside his door. Steady, purposeful steps that passed his apartment, continued to the end of the hall, then stopped. He lay still, listening, but heard nothing else. Old building, he told himself. Sound travels strangely through old buildings. The woman with the walker, perhaps, though the footsteps had seemed quicker, more certain than hers. The next night, the same thing. 3:17 exactly. Footsteps passing his door, walking to the end of the hall, stopping. On the 3rd night, Michael got up and looked through the peephole, but the hallway was empty, lit by a single weak bulb that turned everything the color of old photographs. The footsteps had definitely passed his door. He'd heard them clearly, but no one was there. He mentioned it to the landlord, a man named Donald Petrie, who managed the property from an office in town. Donald listened with the patient expression of someone accustomed to tenant complaints about old buildings. "It's the expansion and contraction," he said, not quite meeting Michael's eyes. "The temperature drops at night, the floorboards settle. Sounds just like footsteps. You'll get used to it." Michael wanted to believe this, but the footsteps were too regular, too purposeful. They had rhythm and weight. They were someone walking, not something settling. Still, he had no other explanation, and complaining further would mark him as the difficult tenant, so he said nothing more. The mirror began showing him things in his second week. Small things, at first. He'd catch movement in it that didn't match his own. A shift in the reflection that happened a half second before he moved, as though the mirror was anticipating him. He'd turn quickly, trying to catch the discrepancy, but it was always gone, leaving him staring at his own tired face and wondering if exhaustion was making him see things that weren't there. Then one morning, while getting dressed, he noticed someone standing behind him in the reflection. Just for an instant, a woman's figure, indistinct, there and gone so quickly he could have imagined it. He spun around. The bedroom was empty. He looked back at the mirror. Only his own reflection stared back, pale and unsettled. Michael started avoiding the bedroom during the day, working at his desk in the living room, eating meals standing at the kitchen counter. He told himself he was being ridiculous, that mirrors didn't show things that weren't there, that he was projecting his loneliness and stress onto an inanimate object. But the feeling persisted, the sense of being watched, of sharing space with something that had no business being there. The footsteps continued nightly, always at 3:17, always following the same path. Michael began waking moments before they started, his body trained to the routine now. He'd lie in the dark, counting down the seconds, and then they'd come, steady, inevitable, ending at the hall's far end where, according to the building's layout, there was nothing but a wall. On his 16th night in the apartment, Michael woke to find a woman standing at the foot of his bed. She was middle-aged, maybe 50, wearing a nightgown that looked decades out of fashion. Her face was ordinary, forgettable, except for her eyes, which held an intensity that made his chest tighten. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching him, with an expression he couldn't read. Terror locked his voice in his throat. They stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, and then she faded, not disappearing suddenly, but gradually losing substance until she was gone. Michael sat up, turned on every light, and spent the rest of the night on the couch with the television on, not watching it, just needing the noise and light. When morning came, he called in sick to work, which was meaningless since work was just his laptop. But he sent the email anyway, establishing a boundary between himself and normal responsibility. He researched the building's history. The textile mill had operated from 1892 until 1956, employing mostly women at industrial sewing machines. There had been a fire in 1923 that killed 3 workers and various industrial accidents over the decades, but nothing that seemed relevant to his specific apartment. The building had been converted to residential use in 2003, and according to public records, his unit had seen 6 tenants in the past 7 years, which seemed like a lot. Michael called the previous tenant, a woman named Lisa Cortland, whose forwarding address he'd found on a piece of mail that kept getting delivered. She answered on the 3rd ring, and when he explained who he was, her voice went careful and distant. "How are you finding the apartment?" she asked, in a tone that suggested she already knew. "There are some unusual aspects," Michael said, trying to sound casual. "The sounds at night, the mirror." A long pause. "You've seen her then?" Michael's hand tightened on the phone. "Who is she?" I don't know her name. I tried to find out, but there's nothing in the records. Nothing anyone will talk about. I lasted 4 months. The woman before me lasted 6 weeks. We're not the first to leave quickly. What does she want? I think... Lisa paused, choosing words carefully. I think she's looking for something she lost. Or someone. She keeps checking, night after night. That's what the footsteps are. Her checking. And the mirror, that's where she sees best. Mirrors and reflective surfaces. She's stronger there. This isn't real, Michael said, though his voice lacked conviction. There's a rational explanation. Then find it, Lisa said, not unkindly. But if you can't, my advice is to leave. I know you probably just moved in. I know it's expensive to relocate, but some things aren't worth the cheap rent. That place takes something from you, bit by bit. You'll start seeing her everywhere, in windows, in the dark television screen, in puddles on the street. And the more you see her, the more real she becomes, until you can't tell anymore what's her and what's you. After hanging up, Michael stood at his living room window, watching November rain streak the glass. He could see his reflection in the window, faint and transparent, and for just a moment, he thought he saw someone standing behind him. When he turned, no one was there. The woman appeared more frequently after that. Not always fully formed, sometimes just a suggestion in the corner of his eye, a disturbance in the air. She seemed drawn to mirrors and glass, manifesting most clearly in reflective surfaces. Michael covered the bathroom mirror with a sheet, unplugged the television, took down a decorative glass picture frame. It didn't help. She found other surfaces, the gloss of the kitchen cabinets, the dark screen of his laptop, the window at night when the lights were on inside. He tried speaking to her once, feeling foolish but desperate. "What do you want? Why are you here?" His voice echoed in the empty apartment. The figure in the window. He'd seen her there while washing dishes. Didn't respond, just continued staring at him with that unsettling intensity, as though she was trying to communicate something vitally important, but had lost the language for it. The footsteps grew louder, more insistent. Michael started timing them, documenting them, trying to find a pattern beyond the nightly 3:17 appearance. He discovered that they sometimes came at other hours too, 7:43 in the morning, 11:51 at night. He cross-referenced these times against historical records of the mill, searching for significance, but found nothing. His sleep deteriorated. The exhaustion made everything worse, blurring the line between waking and dreaming. He'd find himself standing in rooms with no memory of entering them, staring at his reflection in the covered bathroom mirror, which he'd apparently uncovered in his sleep. His appetite vanished. His work suffered. The few friends who still called after the divorce noticed something wrong in his voice, but he couldn't explain it without sounding unhinged. One night, Michael woke to find the woman sitting on the edge of his bed, close enough to touch. She was more solid than he'd ever seen her, almost alive, and she was holding something in her hands. A photograph, though he couldn't make out the details. She looked at him, then at the photograph, then back at him, and her expression was so full of loss and longing that he felt it in his chest like a physical weight. "I don't understand," he whispered. "Show me. Help me understand." She stood and walked to the mirror, still holding the photograph. She pointed at it, then at the mirror, then at Michael. The gesture was clear. She wanted him to look, Michael got out of bed, his legs unsteady, and approached the mirror. In the reflection, the bedroom looked different. The furniture was arranged differently, older styles from decades past. The walls were a different color, and in the mirror's version of the bed, someone was sleeping. A man, younger than Michael, but with similar features. The woman moved to stand beside the sleeping man in the reflection, placing her hand on his shoulder with infinite gentleness. "Who is he?" Michael asked, though he was beginning to understand. The woman in the mirror turned to look at him directly, and for the first time, she spoke, though her voice came from somewhere far away, distorted and faint. Thomas. The name meant nothing to Michael, but the woman's face transformed when she said it, filling with such love and pain that he had to look away. When he looked back, the mirror showed his normal bedroom, and the woman was gone. Michael spent the next day researching the name Thomas in connection with the building. He found him in old census records, Thomas Avery, listed as residing at this address in 1951, occupation listed as mill supervisor. Michael searched further and found Thomas's death certificate. He died in 1952 at age 34, cause of death listed as accidental fall. More searching revealed a brief newspaper article. Thomas Avery had fallen from a third-floor window of the mill during a late-night inspection. His wife, Margaret Avery, had been present at the time, though the article didn't specify where. She'd told investigators he'd been checking a stuck window when he lost his balance. No foul play was suspected. Margaret Avery had continued living at the mill for another year, then disappeared from public records. No death certificate, no forwarding address, nothing. She'd simply vanished from documentation in 1953. Michael looked up from his laptop to find the woman, Margaret, standing by his desk. In the daylight, she was less substantial, more like heat shimmer than solid form, but her eyes were clear and desperate. "He fell," Michael said. "It was an accident." She shook her head slowly, firmly. It wasn't an accident. She moved to the window, the same window Thomas had fallen from, though it had been replaced and modified over the decades. She placed her hand against the glass and looked back at Michael with an expression that asked, "Can you see it now?" Michael crossed to the window and looked down at the street 3 floors below. "You pushed him." Margaret's reflection in the window glass nodded slowly. "Why?" Her lips moved, but no sound came. She tried again, and this time a whisper reached him. "Trapped." Michael understood then. Not trapped in the building, trapped in the marriage, in the life, in the role expected of her. How many women of that era had felt the same? How many had done something about it? And how many had been unable to live with what they'd done? "You've been looking for him," Michael said. "All these years, the footsteps, the checking. You're searching for Thomas." Margaret's reflection showed such profound sadness that Michael's eyes burned. She'd killed him, then been unable to live with the guilt, and had stayed here for decades, caught between the living world and whatever came after, endlessly searching for a man she'd destroyed. "He's not here," Michael said gently. "Whatever happened after, wherever he went, it's not here. You're alone here." Margaret turned from the window to face him directly, and for the first time, he saw her clearly. Not a monster, not a ghost in the horror movie sense, but a woman who'd made a terrible choice and been unable to escape its consequences. The mirror had been her window between worlds, the place where she could see things as they'd been. searching for a way to undo what couldn't be undone. "I can't help you find him," Michael said. "I don't know how." Margaret's form began to fade, but before she disappeared completely, she reached out and touched Michael's hand. The contact was cold, but not unpleasant, and with it came a rush of feeling. Her loneliness, her regret, her endless, exhausting search for redemption that would never come. Then she was gone, and Michael was alone in his apartment, staring at his own reflection in the window. The footsteps continued after that, but they felt different now, less threatening. They were just the sound of someone searching, night after night, refusing to give up even though the search was hopeless. Michael grew accustomed to them, even found them comforting in a strange way. He wasn't alone here. Someone else understood what it meant to be trapped by your own choices, unable to move forward, unable to go back. He stayed in the apartment despite everything. The rent was still cheap, and besides, where else would he go? His life had become small enough to fit here, in this space haunted by old decisions and older regrets. Sometimes, late at night, he'd stand before the mirror and wonder if Margaret could see him the way he'd seen her. If somehow he'd become part of her endless search, another figure haunting a space neither of them could leave. The thought should have terrified him, but instead it brought a sense of understanding. They were both looking for something they'd lost, something that couldn't be recovered. They were both trapped by the weight of the past, unable to let go, unable to move on. In the mirror's dark glass, their reflections overlapped, and Michael couldn't tell anymore which one was the ghost and which one was real. The rain continued falling outside, and somewhere in the building, footsteps echoed through empty halls, searching, always searching for something that was gone. Story 2. The support group met every Tuesday evening in the basement of St. Catherine's Church, a room that smelled of instant coffee and the particular mustiness that comes from hymnals stored in damp conditions. Helen Travers had been attending for 6 weeks, ever since her daughter Jessica had gently but firmly suggested that grief counseling might help with what she called the situation. The situation being that Helen's husband of 34 years, Robert, had died suddenly of a heart attack in March, and Helen had not adjusted well. She kept his clothes in the closet. She set a place for him at dinner. She spoke to him as though he were still there, sitting in his chair by the window, reading the newspaper, making his small observations about the neighbors' poor landscaping choices or the declining quality of produce at the local market. Jessica worried, which Helen understood but found tiresome. Grief had its own timetable. She wanted to tell her daughter. The books and websites all said that. Everyone processed loss differently. Helen's way of processing involved maintaining certain routines that made Robert's absence feel less absolute, less permanent, less real. The group consisted of 7 people, led by a pastoral counselor named Marion Beck, who wore flowing skirts and spoke in the kind of gentle, carefully modulated voice that made Helen want to scream. They sat in a circle of folding chairs, holding paper cups of terrible coffee, and took turns talking about their dead. There was Douglas, whose wife had died of cancer after a 2-year battle. There was Patricia, who'd lost her adult son to suicide. There was an elderly man named Frank, whose husband had died of complications from pneumonia. Each of them carried their grief like luggage, visible and acknowledged. They cried openly. They talked about anger and acceptance and moving forward, Helen found them exhausting. She didn't cry during the meetings. She spoke when called upon, offering the basic facts: Robert's death, the suddenness of it, the difficulty of adjusting, but nothing deeper. She could feel Marion watching her with professional concern, clearly sensing Helen's resistance to the process. After the fourth meeting, Marion had pulled her aside. "Grief can't be rushed," Marion said, using that gentle voice. "But it also can't be avoided. At some point, we have to face the reality of our loss." Helen had smiled politely and said she understood, though what she understood was that Marion Beck, despite her degrees and training, knew nothing about Helen's particular situation. How could she? Helen hadn't told anyone the truth being that Robert had come back. It started 3 days after the funeral. Helen had been sitting in the living room, staring at nothing, when she felt him. Not saw, not heard, but felt. His presence in the room, as real and solid as when he'd been alive. She'd turned toward his chair and known, with absolute certainty, that he was sitting there. "Robert?" she'd whispered. The air in the room had changed, grown warmer, and she'd felt what could only be described as acknowledgement. He was there. He'd heard her. He couldn't respond in the traditional sense, but he was present, and he knew she knew. From that moment, Helen's grief had transformed into something else. Not relief exactly, but a sense of continuity. Robert hadn't left, not really. He was still there, still with her, still part of her daily life. She fell back into their old routines naturally. She made coffee for 2 in the morning, setting his cup on the counter where he always took it. She cooked the dinners he'd enjoyed. She told him about her day and felt his attention on her, listening. Jessica had noticed immediately. "Mom, you're talking to yourself." "I'm talking to your father." "Mom," that tone, the one that said, "I'm worried about you. You're not handling this well. Maybe we should talk to your doctor." Helen had learned to be more careful after that. She maintained the routines when alone, but performed normalcy when Jessica visited. She pretended Robert was gone when his daughter was watching, even though she could feel his presence, feel his frustration at being ignored, at having his own child act as though he'd ceased to exist. The support group was meant to demonstrate progress to Jessica, proof that Helen was dealing with it in an acceptable way. So Helen attended and listened to the others talk about their dead as though they were truly gone, and said nothing about the fact that Robert sat beside her in the empty folding chair to her left, his presence a comfort that none of these people would understand. Then, in the 7th week, something changed. A new member joined the group, a woman about Helen's age named Claire Drummond. She'd lost her husband 6 months earlier and carried herself with the shell-shocked expression of someone still adjusting to permanent loss. Marion introduced her, and Claire took the empty seat to Helen's right, directly across from where Robert sat. The meeting proceeded normally. People shared. Marion offered gentle observations. Helen half listened, more attuned to Robert's presence than to the words being spoken. But she noticed Claire kept glancing at the empty chair beside Helen, the one where Robert sat. Brief looks, then away, then back again, her expression growing increasingly troubled. When the meeting ended and people were gathering their coats, Claire approached Helen with visible hesitation. "I'm sorry to bother you," Claire said quietly, "but I have to ask, the chair next to you, is someone sitting there?" Helen's heart seized. She looked at Claire carefully, seeing past the grief to something else. Recognition, perhaps. Understanding. What makes you ask that? I kept seeing. Claire hesitated, clearly questioning her own sanity. Movement, like someone was sitting there, shifting position the way people do, but the chair is empty. Helen made a decision in that moment, one she'd later question, but couldn't bring herself to regret. Would you like to get coffee? Actual coffee, not the church kind. There's a diner 2 blocks from here. They sat in a booth at the back of the diner, away from the few other customers. Helen had felt Robert's presence following them, sitting beside her on the vinyl bench seat, and she could see Claire's eyes, flickering to that space, seeing something she couldn't quite identify. My husband Robert died in March, Helen said, but he didn't leave. He's still with me. He's sitting here right now. Claire's face went pale, then flushed. You can see him? Not see exactly. Feel. Know. I'm aware of his presence the way you're aware of someone standing behind you, even when you're not looking directly at them. I thought I was losing my mind, Claire whispered. David, my husband, I feel him too, in our house, in our car, everywhere I go. I thought it was denial, or magical thinking, or early onset dementia. They talked for 2 hours, comparing experiences. Claire's husband David manifested similarly to Robert, a presence rather than an apparition, felt rather than seen, but undeniably there. Both women had maintained routines with their dead husbands. Both had been warned by concerned family members that this wasn't healthy grieving. Both had felt profoundly alone in their experience, unable to share it without being labeled delusional or worse. Why us? Claire asked finally. Why did they come back to us and not others? Helen had thought about this extensively during her solitary evenings with Robert. I think it's about the bond. 34 years of marriage isn't something that just ends because someone's heart stops. Maybe love is strong enough to anchor someone here. Or maybe we refuse to let go, and that refusal creates the space for them to stay. Marion would say we're in denial, Claire said. Marion doesn't know everything. They began meeting separately from the group once a week at the diner. They'd sit in their booth, their dead husbands present beside them, and talk about the strange half-life they were all living. Helen felt less alone than she had since Robert's death. Claire understood. She didn't judge. She lived the same reality. The complications started in the 3rd month. Helen began noticing that Robert's presence felt heavier, more insistent. He was there constantly now, not just at home, but everywhere she went. The supermarket, the doctor's office, the library. His attention felt like weight on her shoulders, like someone standing too close in an elevator. She mentioned it to Claire, who admitted experiencing something similar with David. He's always there now, Claire said, her voice strained. I can't even shower without feeling him watching. I know that sounds paranoid, but it's like he's forgotten I need space, or he can't stand to be apart from me, even for a moment. Helen understood exactly. The comforting presence had become oppressive. Robert's attention, once a source of solace, now felt demanding, possessive. She'd wake in the night to the overwhelming sense of being watched, studied, needed in a way that exhausted her. Maybe we should tell them to leave, Claire suggested tentatively during one of their coffee meetings. The thought sent a jolt of something through Helen. Fear, guilt, protectiveness. How can we? They stayed for us because we needed them. Maybe we need something different now. Helen felt Robert's presence intensify beside her, as though he'd heard and was rejecting the suggestion. She could feel his opposition, his refusal to be dismissed. He'd stayed because she'd wanted him to. She couldn't change her mind now. That wasn't how love worked. But the presence continued growing heavier. Helen found herself exhausted all the time, as though Robert's manifestation was drawing energy from her. She lost weight. She stopped sleeping well. Jessica noticed and made another worried phone call, suggesting that maybe the grief counseling wasn't working. Maybe Helen needed to see an actual therapist. Maybe medication would help. Helen went through the motions of normalcy. Doctor visits, therapy sessions, all of which found her physically healthy, but emotionally depleted. No one asked if she was being haunted by her husband's too intense devotion, because who would think to ask that? Claire deteriorated faster. She showed up to their weekly coffee meeting looking drawn, almost gray, with dark circles under her eyes. "I can't do this anymore," she said without preamble. "David's love has become a burden. He won't leave me alone, not even for a moment. I feel him everywhere, all the time, and it's suffocating me. I think..." She paused, voice breaking. "I think he's keeping me from living." Helen knew she should offer comfort, but she felt the same thing. Robert's presence had transformed from gift to obligation. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt truly alone, truly at rest. His attention was constant, unwavering, and absolutely draining. "What can we do?" Helen asked. "I've been researching," Claire said quietly. "Not grief counseling resources, other things. There are people who deal with situations like ours. Mediums, spiritual advisors. I found one about an hour away who specializes in helping spirits transition. Transition to where? Wherever they're supposed to be when they're not here anymore." Helen felt Robert's presence surge with something that felt like panic or anger. He doesn't want to go. Do we want him to stay? Claire's question hung in the air between them. Helen thought about the weight she'd been carrying, the exhaustion, the sense of being constantly watched and needed and consumed by Robert's relentless presence. She thought about the years ahead, decades possibly, living like this, never alone, but never quite herself either. "I don't know," she said finally. They drove together to see the medium the following week, their dead husbands manifesting strongly in the car's back seat, a pressure so intense that Claire had to pull over twice, overwhelmed by the sense of being surrounded, suffocated by invisible attention. The medium, a matter-of-fact woman named Dr. Sandra Oakes, who held a Ph.D. in religious studies, saw them immediately. She worked from a converted farmhouse, her office lined with books on thanatology and comparative religion rather than the crystal balls and tarot cards Helen had half expected. "You've been maintaining bonds with deceased loved ones," Dr. Oakes said within minutes. No need for preamble. "The bonds have become parasitic. This is more common than you'd think." "Parasitic?" Claire's voice shook. "They're drawing energy from you to maintain manifestation. Not intentionally malicious, but the effect is the same. They're depleting you to sustain themselves. If it continues, you'll both experience severe health consequences." Helen felt Robert's presence recoil slightly, as though the accusation stung. "He wouldn't hurt me." Not consciously, no. But love doesn't always recognize its own destructiveness. They're staying because you called them back, because you gave them anchor and energy. They won't leave unless you release them, and you won't heal unless they go. The session lasted 3 hours. Dr. Oakes explained the process, a ritual of release that would sever the bonds allowing the dead to manifest. It required active participation from both the living and dead, a mutual acknowledgement that continuation in this form wasn't healthy for either party. "Will it hurt them?" Helen asked. "There is no them in the way you're conceptualizing it," Dr. Oakes said gently. "What's been here with you isn't your husband's complete consciousness or soul. It's an imprint animated by your need and given substance by your energy. Releasing it doesn't harm Robert or David. It simply allows what remains of them to dissipate naturally, the way it should have done months ago." That evening, Helen sat alone in her living room, feeling Robert's presence beside her in his chair. She'd lived with it so long now that she couldn't imagine the space without him. But she also couldn't ignore the truth. She was tired, so deeply, profoundly tired. And the presence that had once comforted her had become the source of her exhaustion. "I love you," she said to the empty room. "I always will. But this isn't right, is it? You staying, me keeping you. It's not healthy for either of us." The air in the room grew cold, and she felt Robert's presence intensify, reaching for her with something like desperation. "I know you don't want to go, but Dr. Oakes is right. This is hurting both of us. I'm keeping you from whatever comes next, and you're keeping me from learning to live without you." She felt his resistance, his refusal, his determined clinging to this half-life they'd created together. "Please," Helen whispered, "please let go." The ritual took place on a Tuesday evening, the same night the grief group met. Claire had brought David's favorite watch. Helen had brought Robert's reading glasses. Dr. Oakes had created a space in her farmhouse's back room, simple and unadorned. No theatrics or mysticism, just a quiet space for goodbye. "Speak to them," Dr. Oakes instructed. "Tell them what you need to say. Give them permission to leave." Helen clutched Robert's glasses, feeling his presence stronger than ever, desperate and afraid and refusing to understand. "Robert, you stayed because I needed you to, but I need something different now. I need to grieve properly. I need to learn to live with your absence, not your ghost. You deserve better than this half-existence, and I deserve to heal." She felt his resistance, his love twisted into something possessive and frightened. "I'm releasing you, with love, with gratitude for the years we had, but I'm releasing you. You have to go now." The presence fought, clinging to her, drawing energy in a way that made her dizzy. She felt Dr. Oakes's hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "He doesn't want to go," Helen said through tears. "Then you have to make him," Dr. Oakes said firmly. "You're the anchor. You have the power here. Use it." Helen closed her eyes and, with more strength than she knew she possessed, visualized cutting a cord, not cruelly, not with anger, but with the firm finality of someone making a necessary decision. "Go," she said. "I love you, but go." The presence shattered. That was the only word for it. She felt Robert's manifestation break apart, the pieces of him that had been held together by her need and his love fragmenting and dispersing like smoke in wind. The weight lifted from her shoulders so suddenly that she gasped. The room was empty. Truly, completely empty for the first time in months. Helen wept then, real grief, finally, the kind Marion Beck would have recognized as healthy and necessary. Beside her, Claire was crying too, both of them mourning properly at last, without the dead watching, without the weight of impossible continuation. The drive home felt different. The car was lighter. The air was clearer. Helen was alone in a way she hadn't been since March, and the loneliness was vast and terrible and absolutely necessary. That night, in her house that no longer held Robert's presence, Helen slept through until morning for the first time in months. She woke feeling lighter, emptier, and the grief that filled the emptiness was clean and sharp and real. She returned to the support group the following Tuesday. Marion Beck noticed something different immediately. The walls Helen had built were gone. When it was her turn to speak, Helen talked about Robert honestly, about missing him, about the empty space he'd left, about learning to live with absence rather than pretending it away. After the meeting, Patricia approached her. "You seem different tonight. Something changed." "I let him go," Helen said simply. "That's the hardest part," Patricia said, understanding in her eyes. "But it's also the only way forward." Helen drove home through the November darkness, feeling Robert's absence like a wound, but also like relief. The house was empty when she arrived. Her footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors. She made dinner for one, sat at the table alone, and ate without speaking to anyone who wasn't there. The grief was pure now, uncomplicated by the supernatural, and somehow that made it bearable. She could miss Robert without being consumed by him. She could remember without being haunted. She could eventually heal. Outside, the rain had started again, tapping against the windows like gentle fingers, like a goodbye, like release. Story 3. The nursing program at Millbrook Community College required 200 clinical hours, and Sarah Chen had been assigned to the long-term care facility on the edge of town for her final rotation. Greenwood Manor was a sprawling single-story building that had been expanded haphazardly over decades, resulting in a floor plan that made no logical sense. Hallways that dead-ended unexpectedly, rooms numbered out of sequence, wings that connected at odd angles. Sarah started her rotation on a Monday in early November, arriving for the evening shift that ran from 3 in the afternoon until 11 at night. The charge nurse, a woman named Dolores Park, who'd worked at Greenwood for 30 years, gave her a brief orientation that consisted mostly of pointing out where supplies were kept and which residents required special attention. "East Wing is memory care," Dolores said as they walked the corridors. "West Wing is general population. Most of them are independent or semi-independent. North Wing is hospice. You'll float between all 3 areas depending on staffing needs." The facility housed 60 residents, though several rooms stood empty. Budget cuts had reduced the nursing staff to skeleton levels, which meant students like Sarah filled crucial gaps in care. She'd been warned about this in her program. Clinical sites often treated students as free labor rather than learners. But she needed the hours to graduate, so she kept her head down and did what was asked. Her first week passed in the exhausting blur common to healthcare work. Vital signs, medication distribution, wound care, documentation. The residents blurred together at first, too many names and faces to track. But gradually, individuals emerged from the crowd. There was Mr. Patterson in room 114, a former postal worker who still organized his belongings as though sorting mail. There was Mrs. Delacroix in room 203, who spoke only French and spent her days knitting scarves for grandchildren who never visited. There was James Holloway in room 316, a veteran who woke screaming from nightmares about jungles that had burned 50 years ago. And there was the woman in room 227. Sarah first encountered her during the second week while distributing evening medications. The room was at the end of a hallway in the west wing, the last door before the corridor terminated at a fire exit. Sarah knocked, received no response, and entered to find an elderly woman sitting in a chair by the window, staring out at the darkening parking lot. "Mrs. Brennan?" Sarah checked her medication cart. "I have your evening medications." The woman didn't turn. She appeared to be in her 80s, with white hair pulled back in a neat bun and hands folded in her lap. She wore a cardigan despite the facility's overheated air, and her posture was rigidly correct, as though she were waiting for something important. Sarah approached and touched the woman's shoulder gently. "Mrs. Brennan, time for your medications." The woman turned slowly, and Sarah felt something cold move through her chest. Mrs. Brennan's eyes were clear and sharp, holding an intensity that seemed out of place in a long-term care resident. She looked at Sarah for a long moment, then smiled slightly. "You're new," she said. Her voice was steady, cultured, with the faint trace of an accent Sarah couldn't identify. "I'm Sarah. I'm a nursing student doing my clinical rotation here." "How nice for you." Mrs. Brennan's tone suggested it was anything but nice. She accepted the small paper cup of pills and the water glass Sarah offered, swallowing the medications efficiently. "Will you be here long?" "Through the end of the semester, about 6 more weeks." Mrs. Brennan handed back the empty cups. "Be careful in this place, Sarah. Not everything here is as it seems." It was the kind of cryptic statement elderly people sometimes made, confusion or dementia creating patterns where none existed. Sarah smiled politely and moved on to her next patient. But something about Mrs. Brennan's words lingered, scratching at the back of her mind. The strange occurrences started small. Sarah would enter a room to find equipment moved, call buttons pressed when no residents had pressed them, curtains opened or closed by no visible hand. She attributed these things to staff she hadn't seen, or to her own fatigue and distraction. Nursing school had taught her that the most obvious explanation was usually correct. Then she started seeing the figure. It happened first during her third week, around 9 in the evening, when the facility had settled into its nighttime routine. Sarah was walking through the east wing, pushing her medication cart, when she saw someone standing at the far end of the hallway. Just a silhouette, backlit by the emergency exit sign's red glow, but clearly a person. "Hello?" Sarah called. "Do you need help?" The figure didn't move. Sarah walked toward it, her footsteps loud on the linoleum floor, and as she got closer, she realized the person was a woman in what looked like an old-fashioned nurse's uniform. White dress, white cap, the kind that hadn't been worn in decades. Before Sarah could get close enough to see clearly, the figure turned and walked through the door marked "Staff Only." Sarah followed, pushing open the door to find a storage room filled with extra linens and supplies. Empty. No other exits. Nowhere the woman could have gone. Sarah stood in the doorway, her heart beating faster than the situation warranted, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the facility's air conditioning. She mentioned it to Dolores during their shift overlap the next day, trying to sound casual. "I saw someone in an old nurse's uniform last night, in the East Wing. Is there maybe a staff member who wears vintage scrubs or something?" Dolores's expression shifted, becoming carefully neutral in a way that told Sarah she'd touched on something. Where exactly did you see this? End of the east wing hallway. She went into the storage room, but when I looked, no one was there. What time? Around 9. Dolores was quiet for a moment, then patted Sarah's arm in a way that was probably meant to be comforting, but felt patronizing. You're working too hard, honey. These long shifts, all that studying. Your mind plays tricks when you're exhausted. I've been here 30 years, and I've never seen anyone in an old uniform. The dismissal was clear, but Sarah noticed something else. Dolores wouldn't meet her eyes, and her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. She was lying. Not about never seeing the figure, perhaps, but about something. Sarah saw the woman in the old uniform twice more that week. Once in the north wing, standing outside room 309, where a hospice patient had died that afternoon. Once in the west wing, near room 227, Mrs. Brennan's room. Each time, the figure would walk away before Sarah could approach, disappearing around corners or through doors, always staying just out of clear sight. The other staff members denied seeing anything unusual, but Sarah began noticing a pattern. Certain nurses avoided specific hallways during night shifts. Certain rooms took longer to answer call buttons, as though staff were reluctant to enter them. And Mrs. Brennan, in room 227, watched everything with those sharp, knowing eyes, smiling slightly whenever Sarah seemed disturbed. During her 4th week, Sarah was assigned to cover the north wing, hospice care. The patients here were dying, some quickly, some slowly, all inevitably. It was the hardest rotation, emotionally draining in ways her textbooks hadn't prepared her for. She learned to provide comfort without offering false hope, to be present with suffering without being consumed by it. Room 309 had a new resident, an elderly man named Arthur Pembroke, who was in the final stages of lung cancer. His breathing was labored, his consciousness drifting in and out. Sarah checked on him regularly, adjusting his oxygen, moistening his lips with a sponge, holding his hand when he seemed distressed. Around 10 o'clock, she entered his room to find the woman in the old nurse's uniform standing beside Arthur's bed. This time, she was close enough for Sarah to see clearly. Middle-aged, perhaps 50, with dark hair under the white cap and a face that was neither kind nor cruel, just professionally attentive. She had one hand on Arthur's forehead, and she was speaking to him in a low voice Sarah couldn't quite hear. Sarah froze in the doorway. The woman looked up, meeting Sarah's eyes directly for the first time, and Sarah felt recognition pass between them. Not personal recognition, but an acknowledgement of shared understanding. The woman nodded slightly, then returned her attention to Arthur. "Wait," Sarah said, finding her voice. "Who are you?" The woman didn't answer. She removed her hand from Arthur's forehead, stepped back from the bed, and walked toward the room's far corner where she simply faded, growing transparent and then disappearing entirely. Sarah's hands shook as she checked Arthur's vital signs. His breathing had eased. His face looked peaceful for the first time since his admission. He died 20 minutes later, quietly, without distress. And Sarah found herself wondering if the woman in the old uniform had somehow helped him transition. The next evening, Sarah went to room 227. Mrs. Brennan was in her usual position by the window, and she smiled when Sarah entered. "You've seen her," Mrs. Brennan said without preamble. "The nurse." Sarah had learned that denying the obvious was pointless with patients who saw clearly. Who is she? Her name was Ruth Calloway. She worked here in the 1960s, when this was a sanatorium rather than a nursing home. Tuberculosis patients mostly. They came here to die slowly, isolated from the healthy world. Mrs. Brennan's voice held the tone of someone reciting well-worn facts. Ruth cared for them with dedication that went beyond professional duty. She was here for their first breath in this facility and their last. She knew every patient by name, every preference, every fear. What happened to her? She contracted tuberculosis herself, nursed patients for 15 years, then became one. She died here in 1967, in a room that's now part of the East Wing. But she never left, not really. She's still caring for patients, still helping them transition. Sarah sat down in the chair across from Mrs. Brennan. How do you know all this? Mrs. Brennan's smile widened. Because I've been here since 1962, dear. I was one of Ruth's patients. The statement made no sense. The woman in front of Sarah appeared elderly, but not impossibly old. If she'd been here in 1962, she would be. Sarah's thoughts stumbled over themselves. She looked at Mrs. Brennan more carefully, noting details she'd missed before. The old-fashioned style of the cardigan, the way Mrs. Brennan never ate the meals delivered to her room, never seemed to sleep, never called for assistance. The way her room felt different from the others, colder, emptier, less lived in. You're not a resident, Sarah said slowly. You're like Ruth. You're dead? Yes, dear. Have been for quite some time. 1964, to be specific. Tuberculosis was already too advanced when I arrived. Ruth cared for me those final months with such gentleness. When I died, I found I couldn't leave her. Couldn't leave this place where she'd shown such compassion. So I stayed. Sarah stood, her instinct telling her to leave, to report this conversation, to do something. But Mrs. Brennan's expression stopped her. Not threatening, just patient, as though waiting for Sarah to understand something important. Why are you telling me this? Because you can see us. Most can't, or won't. They sense something off, avoid certain areas, but they don't truly see. You see clearly, which means you have a gift, and gifts come with responsibilities. What kind of responsibilities? Mrs. Brennan gestured to the window, to the facility beyond. There are more of us here than just Ruth and me. The dead don't always leave places where they died, especially if they died with unfinished business or if someone living gave them reason to stay. This facility has been a place of death for over 60 years. Many have remained. Sarah thought about the cold spots in certain hallways, the rooms staff avoided, the sense of being watched that permeated some areas. How many? Dozens. Some are peaceful, like Ruth, still performing the duties they knew in life. Others are confused, caught in the moments of their dying, repeating their final hours endlessly. And some, Mrs. Brennan's expression darkened. Some are angry. They died badly, in pain, neglected, and they haven't forgiven. Sarah's clinical training reasserted itself. This was delusion, shared psychosis perhaps, or her own exhaustion creating narratives from random stimuli. But even as she thought this, she knew it wasn't true. She'd seen Ruth Calloway with her own eyes, watched her fade into nothing. She was talking to a woman who claimed to be dead, and some deep part of Sarah knew that claim was accurate. What do you want from me? Help, Mrs. Brennan said simply. "Ruth and I do what we can, but there are so many, and some are beyond our reach. They need someone living, someone who can interact with both worlds, someone who can help them finish what's keeping them here." Over the following weeks, Sarah learned to navigate Greenwood Manor's dual reality. During the day, she performed her nursing duties, caring for the living residents with professional competence. But during evening and night shifts, she became aware of the others, the dead who remained. There was Henry Ashford in what had been room 107, who died in 1973 and still believed he was waiting for his son to visit. Sarah learned that his son had died in Vietnam, and Henry had never been told. She sat with his ghost one evening and gently explained that his son wasn't coming, that it was time to let go of the waiting. There was Margaret Quinn, who died during a surgery in the facility's early
days and still wandered the hallways looking for the recovery room, confused and frightened. Sarah guided her, speaking in the calm tones they'd taught her in school, until Margaret understood that the surgery was over, had been over for decades, and it was all right to stop searching. There was Donald Reese, one of the angry ones, who died of neglect when an understaffed shift had failed to respond to his call button as he choked on his dinner. He manifested as rage and cold, making certain rooms uninhabitable, pushing equipment, terrifying staff. Sarah spent hours talking to him, acknowledging his death as unjust, offering the apology the facility had never given. His anger didn't disappear, but it lessened, became more focused, less destructive. Ruth Calloway watched Sarah's work with approval, sometimes appearing to guide her to ghosts who needed help, sometimes simply standing witness as Sarah negotiated between worlds. Mrs. Brennan became her advisor, explaining the rules of this hidden reality, how the dead were strongest at transition times, dusk and dawn, how they could manifest more easily in places associated with their deaths, how they hungered for acknowledgement, for resolution, for permission to leave. The work was exhausting. Sarah's grades began to slip as she spent more time with the dead than with her textbooks. Her clinical supervisor noticed her distraction, but attributed it to the emotional toll of hospice care. Dolores watched her with knowing eyes, but said nothing, and Sarah suspected the charge nurse saw more than she admitted. By her final week of rotation, Sarah had helped 11 ghosts find release. Some left easily, gratefully, as though they'd been waiting for someone to give them permission. Others fought, clinging to the familiar pain of haunting, rather than facing the unknown of what came after. But gradually, the facility felt lighter, less oppressed by accumulated grief. On her last shift, Sarah visited room 227. Mrs. Brennan was in her chair by the window, as always, but something had changed in her expression. "You've done good work," Mrs. Brennan said. "Better than I hoped. I couldn't have done it without your guidance. You have a gift for this, Sarah. The living rarely have patience for the dead, but you do. You see us as still human, still deserving of care. That's rare." Mrs. Brennan paused, "Which is why I need to ask you something difficult." Sarah waited. "It's time for me to go. I've stayed here too long, anchored by my attachment to Ruth, by my belief that I was needed. But the truth is, I've been afraid of what comes next, afraid of leaving the familiar. You've helped the others face that fear. I need you to help me too." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't know if I can. I don't know the right words." "There are no right words. There's just honesty and compassion, the same tools you've been using all along." They sat together as night deepened outside the window, and Sarah talked to Mrs. Brennan about fear and transition and letting go. She talked about how staying out of fear wasn't really staying at all, just delaying the inevitable. She talked about Ruth Calloway, who'd remained to serve but would understand if Mrs. Brennan chose to leave. She talked until her voice was hoarse, until she'd said everything she could think to say. Finally, Mrs. Brennan stood. "Thank you, dear. You've given me what I needed. Permission, I suppose, or courage, or maybe just companionship through the difficult moment. Will it hurt? I don't think so. I think it will be like finally exhaling after holding your breath too long." Mrs. Brennan smiled. "Take care of yourself, Sarah. The gift you have is valuable, but don't let it consume you. The dead have had their time. Yours is still ahead." Mrs. Brennan walked to the center of the room, and Sarah watched as she began to fade. Not suddenly, but gradually, like morning fog burned away by rising sun. She became transparent, then translucent, then simply gone, and the room felt emptier and somehow warmer all at once. Sarah sat alone in room 227 until her shift ended, then gathered her things and left Greenwood Manor for the last time. Her clinical rotation was complete. She'd earned her hours, passed her requirements, and would graduate in December. She never told anyone about the work she'd really done there. Her clinical evaluation praised her compassion and attentiveness, her ability to provide comfort to difficult patients, her mature handling of death and dying. The words were accurate, just incomplete. They described caring for the living without acknowledging her work with the dead. Ruth Calloway appeared one final time as Sarah was leaving, standing near the front entrance in her white uniform. She nodded to Sarah, a gesture of respect between colleagues, and Sarah nodded back. Then Ruth faded, returning to her eternal rounds, caring for patients who no longer breathed, providing comfort that transcended mortality. Sarah drove home through the November darkness, exhausted and changed. She'd entered nursing to care for the living, but she'd discovered a parallel duty to the dead. She didn't know yet how she'd balance both, or if she'd continue to see ghosts in her future work. But she knew that her understanding of care had expanded to include those who'd already passed, and that knowledge would shape every patient interaction that followed. The dead deserved compassion too. They deserved to be heard, acknowledged, helped toward whatever came next. And if Sarah had the ability to provide that help, then perhaps it was less a curse than a calling. One more way to fulfill the promise she'd made when she chose nursing, to care for those in need, whoever and wherever they were. Story 4. The Forest Service station sat 12 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a gravel road that washed out every spring and froze solid every winter. Marcus Webb had requested the position specifically because of its isolation. After 2 years working the crowded national parks, dealing with tourists who treated wilderness like a theme park, he craved the silence and solitude of a remote posting. The station was a simple structure: 2 rooms plus a bathroom, solar panels on the roof, a radio for emergency communication. Marcus's job was straightforward: monitor the surrounding forest for fires, maintain the trails, document wildlife, and file reports. He'd been told the position typically went to rangers nearing retirement, people who'd earned the right to solitude. But Marcus was 31, burned out on humanity, and had lobbied hard enough that they'd given him a shot. He arrived in early October, just as the aspens were turning gold. The outgoing ranger, a man named Dale Comstock, who'd held the position for 12 years, spent 3 days showing Marcus the routine. Dale was in his 60s, weathered and quiet, and he seemed reluctant to leave, despite having retired voluntarily. On their last day together, Dale stood at the station's window, looking out at the forest that stretched in every direction. "You'll do fine here," he said, though his tone suggested doubt. "Just remember, you're not as alone as you think." Marcus had assumed this referred to the wildlife: bears, mountain lions, elk, standard warnings. "I'll be careful." Dale turned to look at him, his expression difficult to read. "I'm not talking about animals. There's something else in these woods, something that watches. You'll feel it after a while, that sense of being observed. Don't ignore it." "What is it?" "I don't know. Never saw it clearly, just glimpses. But it's been here the whole time I have, maybe longer. Probably always." Dale picked up his bag. "My advice? Acknowledge it. Don't pretend it's not there. It doesn't like being ignored." Then he left, driving down the gravel road in his truck, and Marcus was alone. The first few weeks passed in peaceful routine. Marcus woke with the sun, hiked the trails checking for damage or hazards, documented the wildlife he encountered, and spent evenings reading by lamplight. The silence was profound, broken only by wind through trees and the occasional cry of a hawk. It was exactly what he'd wanted. The watching started in his 3rd week. Marcus first noticed it while splitting firewood behind the station, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, the instinctive awareness of being observed. He'd looked up, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing, just aspens and pines, shadows and light. Still, the feeling persisted, strong enough that he'd carried his axe inside with him, feeling foolish but unable to shake the unease. The sensation returned regularly after that. Always when he was outside, always strongest when he was alone in the forest. Not threatening exactly, but intensely present. The awareness of another consciousness focused on him, studying him, waiting for something. Marcus tried to rationalize it. Isolation played tricks on the mind. He was probably sensing wildlife that was better at hiding than he was at spotting. Mountain lions were known for watching humans without being seen. But this didn't feel like animal attention. It felt more deliberate, more intelligent, more patient. He remembered Dale's advice: acknowledge it, don't ignore it. So, one morning while hiking the North Trail, Marcus stopped and spoke to the forest. "I know you're there. I don't know what you are, but I know you're watching. I'm not here to cause problems. I'm just doing my job. We can coexist peacefully." His voice sounded absurd in the silence, but something shifted in the quality of attention he felt. Not disappearance, but a subtle change, as though the watcher had heard and was considering his words. The encounters began after that. Small things at first. Marcus would return from a hike to find objects in the station moved. His coffee mug relocated to a different counter, his jacket hung on a different hook. Never anything threatening, just slight alterations that suggested someone had been inside while he was gone. He checked the locks, found them secure, and told himself he was forgetting where he'd put things. Then he started finding gifts. That's what he came to call them, though he wasn't certain they were intentional offerings. A perfectly round stone placed on his doorstep. A bird's feather standing upright in the dirt, too deliberately positioned to be accidental.
an arrangement of pine cones in a spiral pattern near the woodpile. Each object placed where he'd find it, each arrangement too purposeful to be natural. Marcus documented these occurrences in his reports, describing them as possible animal behavior or unusual natural phenomena. He didn't mention the growing certainty that something was trying to communicate with him. The Forest Service would just recall him for psychological evaluation. In his 6th week, he saw it for the first time. Marcus was hiking the southern trail at dusk, pushing his luck with daylight, when he caught movement in his peripheral vision. He turned to see a figure standing among the trees about 50 yards away. Tall, perhaps 7 feet, with proportions that were almost but not quite human. It stood utterly still, partially obscured by pine branches, and the light was too dim to make out details. But Marcus knew with absolute certainty that this was what had been watching him. They stared at each other across the distance. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs, but he forced himself to remain calm. Running would be pointless. If this thing wanted to harm him, it had had weeks of opportunity. "Hello," Marcus said, his voice steady despite his fear. The figure didn't respond, just continued standing motionless. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, it stepped backward into deeper shadow and disappeared. Marcus made his way back to the station quickly, but without running, his awareness sharp, scanning for movement. The sense of being watched was stronger than ever, but the quality had changed again. Not hostile, but intensely curious, as though the figure was trying to understand what Marcus was. That night, lying in his bunk, Marcus heard footsteps outside the station. Slow, heavy steps that circled the building, pausing at each window. He lay frozen, listening, as whatever it was completed its circuit and then moved away into the forest. In the morning, he found tracks in the soft ground near the station, footprints that looked almost human but were larger, deeper, the toes spread wider than human anatomy allowed. Marcus photographed the tracks and sent them to the Forest Service with a vague report about possible bear activity. He knew they weren't bear tracks, but what else could he say? He'd seen something impossible, something that officially didn't exist, and admitting that would end his posting. The visits became more frequent. Every few nights, Marcus would hear the footsteps circling the station, would sense the figure standing outside, observing. More gifts appeared, arranged leaves, stacked stones, once a dead rabbit placed neatly on the doorstep. No marks on it, as though it had simply been set down gently. Marcus began leaving his own offerings in response, a handful of dried fruit, a shiny metal button, an old pocket knife he didn't need. He'd place these items on a flat rock near the tree line and return hours later to find them gone, replaced with the figure's own gifts. They were developing a language of sorts, a communication through objects and gestures. In his 10th week, Marcus encountered the figure face to face. He'd been hiking the eastern trail in late afternoon when he rounded a bend and found it standing in the middle of the path, waiting. Up close, in better light, he could see it clearly. Humanoid, but definitely not human. Covered in dark hair, face both familiar and utterly alien. Its eyes were the most disturbing feature, too intelligent, too aware, holding a depth of comprehension that suggested this was no simple animal. Marcus stopped walking. They were perhaps 20 feet apart, close enough that he could smell it, earth and pine, and something musky.
The figure watched him with those impossible eyes, and Marcus felt the weight of its attention like physical pressure. "I'm not going to hurt you," Marcus said quietly. "I don't know if you understand my words, but I hope you understand the intention. I'm not a threat." The figure tilted its head, a gesture so human that Marcus's breath caught. It was listening, not just hearing, but actively listening, processing meaning. After a long moment, it raised one hand. The fingers were too long, the palm too broad, and pointed at Marcus, then at itself, then at the forest around them. The meaning was clear. "You, me, this place. We share it." "Yes," Marcus said. "We share it. I understand." The figure nodded, another unnervingly human gesture, then stepped off the trail and disappeared into the thick underbrush with remarkable silence for something so large. Marcus stood on the trail for a long time after it left, his mind working through implications. He'd just communicated with something that wasn't supposed to exist, something that had been in these forests long before the Forest Service, long before the rangers, possibly long before humans had settled this region at all. And it wasn't hostile. It was curious, cautious, perhaps lonely. The thought struck him then. How long had this creature been here? How long had it watched rangers come and go, watched humans cut trails through its territory, build stations in its forest? Dale had been here 12 years and sensed it the whole time. How many rangers before Dale had felt the watching eyes, heard the footsteps, found the inexplicable arrangements of natural objects? Marcus began researching indigenous legends from the region. He found stories about forest spirits, guardians, beings that existed in the boundary between human and animal. Different tribes had different names, but the descriptions were remarkably consistent. Tall, hair-covered, human-like, but not human, intelligent, reclusive, and deeply connected to the land. The academic term was cryptid. The popular term was Sasquatch. But sitting alone in his station with the weight of that intelligent gaze still lingering in his memory, Marcus thought both terms missed something essential. This wasn't a monster or a missing link. It was simply another consciousness, another kind of intelligence that had chosen to remain hidden from the human world. The relationship continued throughout the winter. The figure would appear occasionally on Marcus's hikes, never threatening, always maintaining distance, but clearly present. The exchange of gifts continued, becoming more sophisticated. Marcus left sketches of the surrounding landscape. The figure left arrangements that Marcus came to recognize as maps, rocks and sticks positioned to indicate water sources, game trails, dangerous areas. They were teaching each other. Marcus learned the forest through the figure's knowledge, understanding patterns he'd never have noticed on his own. And the figure learned about humans through Marcus, observing his routines, his tools, his way of moving through the world. Marcus stopped filing reports about the unusual occurrences. What could he say that wouldn't sound like madness or lies? Instead, he kept a private journal, documenting every encounter, every gift, every moment of communication. If he was losing his mind to isolation, at least he'd have a record of the descent. But he didn't feel mad. He felt more grounded than he had in years, more present, more aware. The forest had ceased being just a workplace and had become something richer, a shared space, a meeting ground between two forms of consciousness. In late March, as the snow melted and the forest began its slow awakening, Marcus found an unusual gift on the rock they used for exchanges.
It was a wooden carving, crude but recognizable. Two figures standing side by side, one clearly human, one clearly the tall figure. Between them, carved with painstaking effort, was a line connecting them. Marcus held the carving, feeling the rough wood against his palm, understanding the message. This had taken time, effort, intention. This was deliberate communication, art created to express something that couldn't be said in any shared language. We are connected. We are not alone. Marcus carved his own response over the next several evenings, working by lamplight, his hands remembering whittling skills from childhood. He created two trees with their root systems intertwined beneath the surface. Same forest, same earth, different but connected. When he left it on the exchange rock, he watched from a distance as the figure emerged from the forest, picked up the carving, examined it carefully, and then did something Marcus had never seen it do before. It pressed the carving to its chest, a gesture of acceptance, of gratitude, of understanding. The seasons turned. Marcus's initial posting was 1 year, with possibility of extension. As that year approached its end, he found himself unable to imagine leaving. The isolation he'd craved had transformed into something deeper. Not loneliness relieved, but connection of a kind he'd never known. The Forest Service contacted him in September, asking about his plans. They could extend his posting or transfer him to a more populated station. Most rangers found 1 year sufficient at such remote assignments. The isolation wore on people. Marcus requested extension without hesitation. His supervisor's voice carried surprise over the radio. "You're sure? Most people are desperate to leave after 1 winter up there." "I'm sure. This is exactly where I need to be." The extension was approved. Another year, possibly more if he wanted it. Marcus stood at his station window that evening, looking out at the forest that had become home, and saw the figure standing at the tree line, visible in the dusk. It raised one hand, goodbye, or hello, or simply acknowledgement. Marcus raised his hand in return. The watching continued, but it no longer felt like observation. It felt like companionship, like shared presence in a world that belonged to both of them and neither of them. Marcus had come to the forest seeking solitude, and he'd found it. But he'd also found something else, something unexpected and profound. He wasn't alone, and neither was the figure in the trees. They'd each found the only other consciousness in this isolated place that could offer understanding. And that understanding had created a bond that transcended species, language, and the vast differences in how they experienced the world. In the evening, Marcus would sit on his porch and watch the forest. Sometimes the figure appeared, standing among the trees, simply being present. Sometimes it didn't, and Marcus would feel its attention from somewhere unseen. It didn't matter. The connection remained constant. They were both watchers now, both guardians, both residents of a forest that needed protecting. And in the careful exchange of gifts and gestures, in the patient development of mutual understanding, they'd created something that had no name, but felt like peace. The seasons continued their cycle. Snow fell and melted. Animals migrated and returned. Trees grew incrementally taller. And in a remote station deep in the forest, a human ranger and something that wasn't quite human continued their careful friendship. Proof that consciousness could find connection even in the most unexpected places, even across boundaries that seemed impossible to cross.
Marcus never told anyone about the figure. When he retired decades later, he would leave only his private journals, sealed and stored, marked for opening 50 years after his death. Let future generations decide what to make of his account. Let them wonder if he'd been truthful or mad, or some combination of both. But in his heart, Marcus knew the truth. He'd been given a rare gift, the chance to know a mind completely different from his own, to communicate across a vast divide, to share space with something ancient and unknowable that had chosen, for whatever reason, to reveal itself to him. And in return, he'd offered respect, patience, and the willingness to see the forest through eyes that weren't his own. It was enough. It was everything. The figure in the trees continued its watching, as it had for uncounted years, as it would for years to come. And for a brief moment in its long existence, it had found a human who watched back, who understood that some presences should remain mysterious, some relationships couldn't be explained, and some connections transcended every difference that should have kept them separate. In the forest where no trails led and few humans ventured, two consciousnesses shared space and time, and that sharing was enough to make the vast wilderness feel a little less empty, a little more like home. Story 5. The antique shop occupied a narrow building wedged between a laundromat and a tax preparation office in a part of town that had seen better decades. Elena Voss had driven past it 100 times without noticing, but on a gray Tuesday in late October, something made her pull over and park. She wasn't looking for anything in particular. Her apartment was already cluttered with the accumulated possessions of her 43 years. Furniture that had belonged to her parents, books she'd collected since childhood, kitchen implements she never used. But lately she'd been feeling restless, as though her life needed some small change to shake loose the routine that had calcified around her. The shop's interior smelled of dust and old wood, and something else she couldn't identify. Age, perhaps, or the particular mustiness that clung to objects that had outlived their original owners. A bell chimed as she entered, and a man emerged from the back room, elderly and stooped, wearing a cardigan with patches at the elbows. "Help you find something?" His voice carried the rasp of long-time smokers. "Just browsing," Elena said, though she wasn't sure that was true. The shop was crammed with the detritus of lives lived and concluded. China cabinets holding mismatched teacups, bookcases sagging under the weight of forgotten authors, tables covered with jewelry that had once adorned women now decades dead. Elena moved through the narrow aisles, running her fingers along surfaces, feeling the weight of all this accumulated history. She found the mirror in the back corner, partially hidden behind a wardrobe. It was a standing mirror, full length, with an ornate wooden frame carved with vines and flowers. The craftsmanship was exceptional, detailed work that suggested it had been expensive when new. The glass was old, slightly warped, giving reflections a dream-like quality. Elena stood before it, studying her reflection. She looked tired, she thought. The fluorescent lights of her office job had drained something from her face, left her looking washed out and older than her years. In the mirror's antique glass, she looked different, softer somehow, less defined, as though she were already becoming a memory. Beautiful piece, isn't it? The shopkeeper had materialized beside her with the silent suddenness of the very old. 1880s, I believe. French. The frame is walnut, hand-carved. The glass is original, which is rare.
Most get replaced over the years. How much? He named a price that was less than she'd expected. Elena should have been suspicious. Beautiful antiques in this condition didn't sell cheap. But something about the mirror called to her. She imagined it in her bedroom, catching the morning light, reflecting a version of herself that was less tired, less worn down by routine. She bought it. The shopkeeper arranged delivery for the following day, and Elena left the shop feeling she'd accomplished something, though she wasn't sure what. The mirror was installed in her bedroom by 2 delivery men who struggled with its weight and awkward shape. Elena directed them to position it in the corner opposite her bed, where it would catch light from the window without creating glare. When they left, she stood before it again, examining her reflection in the familiar setting of her own bedroom. The mirror made the room look different, larger somehow, and older. The modern furniture she'd bought from big box stores seemed cheap and temporary in the mirror's reflection, while the few antique pieces she'd inherited from her grandmother looked more substantial, more real. Elena adjusted the angle slightly, then stepped back, satisfied. That night, lying in bed, she found herself staring at the mirror. In the darkness, it reflected only shadows and the faint glow of streetlight through the curtains. But she had the unsettling feeling that the mirror was reflecting more than just her room, that it showed depths her eyes couldn't penetrate, layers of space that existed beyond the physical walls. She turned to face the opposite wall and tried to sleep, but the awareness of the mirror behind her made rest difficult. Finally, she got up and threw a sheet over it, instantly feeling foolish. She was a grown woman, spooked by furniture. But with the mirror covered, sleep came easier. In the morning, the sheet had fallen to the floor. Elena picked it up, examining it for tears or weak spots that might have caused it to slip, but found none. She'd tucked it securely around the frame. It shouldn't have fallen. She left the mirror uncovered and went about her day. Work, grocery shopping, the mundane tasks that filled her weekday hours. But as she drove home through the autumn dusk, she found herself thinking about the mirror, anticipating seeing it again, with an intensity that seemed disproportionate. That night, she dreamed she was standing before the mirror, but her reflection wasn't moving in sync with her. It stood still while she moved, or moved while she stood still, always a half second out of phase. In the dream, this didn't frighten her. It seemed natural, as though her reflection had always had its own autonomy, and she was only now noticing. She woke to find herself standing in front of the mirror in darkness, no memory of getting out of bed. Her hand was pressed against the glass, and the surface felt warm, as though something on the other side was pressing back. Elena jerked away, her heart hammering. She'd been sleepwalking. That was the only explanation. Stress at work, the disruption of bringing new furniture into her space, these things could trigger sleepwalking in people predisposed to it. But she couldn't shake the memory of the warmth under her palm, or the sense that something on the other side of the glass had been reaching for her. The incidents escalated over the following weeks. Elena would wake to find herself standing before the mirror, her hand against the glass. She'd catch movement in the mirror's reflection that didn't match her own. A turn of the head, a shift of posture, always in her peripheral vision, gone when she looked directly. She'd hear sounds coming from the mirror at night, soft whispers that might have been wind,
or might have been words in a language she almost recognized. She should have gotten rid of the mirror, should have called the antique shop and demanded they take it back. But something stopped her. The mirror had become important to her in ways she couldn't articulate. When she looked into it, she saw not just her reflection, but possibilities, versions of herself that could exist if circumstances were different, if choices had fallen another way, if her life had taken different paths. One evening, arriving home late from work, Elena stood before the mirror and spoke to it for the first time. "What do you want?" Her reflection stared back, silent. But something shifted in the quality of the glass, a subtle rippling like water disturbed by a stone. And in that ripple, Elena saw something else. Not her bedroom, but a different room. Same dimensions, but furnished differently. Older furniture, gaslight instead of electric lamps, wallpaper in a pattern she didn't recognize. The vision lasted only a moment. Then her normal bedroom returned. But Elena understood. The mirror didn't just reflect the present. It held memories of all the rooms it had occupied, all the lives it had witnessed. It was showing her its history. Over the next several nights, Elena spent hours before the mirror, watching as it revealed fragments of its past. She saw a woman in Victorian dress standing where Elena now stood, examining her reflection with the same intense attention. She saw a different room, smaller, shabbier, the mirror reflecting poverty instead of middle-class comfort. She saw a man with a mustache carefully adjusting the mirror's angle, positioning it just so. And she saw herself, but not herself. A woman who looked like her but wore different clothes, different expressions, who moved through a room that was her bedroom, but also wasn't. Parallel versions, Elena thought. The mirror was showing her possibilities, alternate paths her life could have taken. The woman who looked like Elena began appearing more frequently. At first, just in glimpses, a flash of movement in the mirror's reflection, a figure standing in the background of the room the mirror showed. But gradually, she became more solid, more present. Elena started thinking of her as the other, the woman she could have been if she'd made different choices, if she'd taken that job offer in Seattle instead of staying in this town, if she'd said yes to Marcus when he'd proposed instead of turning him down out of fear, if she'd pursued art school instead of the safe, practical degree her parents had encouraged. The other looked happier than Elena, more confident. She moved through her reflected space with purpose and ease that Elena had never managed. And when the other looked directly out of the mirror, her eyes held no judgment, only invitation. One night, unable to sleep, Elena stood before the mirror and reached out to touch the glass. The other reached out simultaneously, their hands meeting at the mirror's surface. The glass felt warm, then soft, then impossibly permeable. Elena's fingers sank through the surface as though through water. The sensation was neither pleasant nor unpleasant, just strange, cool and resistant, but yielding. She pulled back quickly, her heart racing, but the other's expression remained calm, encouraging. "What are you?" Elena whispered. The other's lips moved, forming words Elena couldn't hear, but the meaning was clear. "I am what you could be. I am the path not taken. I am the life you set aside." Elena thought about her own life, the small apartment, the unfulfilling job, the careful routines that kept everything manageable and nothing exciting. She thought about the choices she'd made in the name of safety, of practicality, of not disappointing the people who'd expected certain things from her. She thought about art supplies gathering dust in her closet, canvases she'd never touched, dreams she'd filed away under someday. The other was all the somedays Elena had postponed, all the risks she hadn't taken, all the versions of herself she'd chosen not to become. Can I? Elena's hand moved toward the mirror again. Can I be you instead? The other smiled and nodded. She stepped back from the mirror, gesturing to the space around her. An artist's loft, Elena realized. Canvases covered the walls, paint splattered floors, afternoon light streaming through large windows. The life Elena had wanted before practicality had intervened. Elena's hand touched the mirror's surface again, and this time she didn't pull back. The glass yielded, accepting her, and she felt herself moving forward, through, into the reflected space. The transition was like diving into warm water. A moment of disorientation, of being between spaces, and then she was standing in the loft, looking around at the life the other had lived. The canvases were beautiful, bold colors, confident brushwork, the kind of art Elena had once dreamed of creating, but had convinced herself she wasn't talented enough to pursue. Behind her, she heard footsteps. Elena turned to see the other standing in what Elena now recognized as her own bedroom, looking around with an expression of mild curiosity. They'd traded places. The other was exploring Elena's life, while Elena stood in the life she could have had. Elena spent hours in the loft, examining everything. Sketchbooks filled with drawings, finished paintings stacked against the walls, art supplies organized with the care of someone who used them daily. This version of herself hadn't given up, hadn't let fear or practicality override passion, had built a life around creating instead of settling for safe mediocrity. But as Elena explored, she began noticing things that disturbed her. Empty wine bottles in the recycling more than seemed reasonable. A pill bottle on the bathroom counter, antidepressants, high dosage, bills marked past due, a calendar with appointments for creditors, for court dates related to unpaid debts. The other had pursued her dreams, but dreams didn't pay rent. She'd built a life around art, and art had failed to sustain her. The confident, happy woman Elena had seen in the mirror was struggling, possibly drowning, in the consequences of choices Elena had been too cautious to make. Elena returned to the mirror, looking through it at her own bedroom. The other was sitting on Elena's bed, examining a photo album. Pictures of Elena's life, the stability she'd built, the security she'd chosen over passion. The other's expression was unreadable. Elena pressed her hand to the mirror from the inside, and the glass rippled. She could return. She could step back through into her own life, her safe apartment, her boring but stable job. Or she could stay here, embrace this life of creation and struggle, accept the consequences of the path she'd once wanted. The other looked up from the album, meeting Elena's eyes through the mirror. Her expression held a question. Do you want this? Really want it? Are you prepared to live with what it costs? Elena thought about the empty wine bottles, the overdue bills, the antidepressants. She thought about her own life, unfulfilling, yes, but also uncomplicated. She'd sacrificed passion for peace, dreams for security. The other had made the opposite choice, and both of them had paid prices for their decisions. Neither life was perfect. Neither path was purely right or wrong. They were just different choices leading to different consequences, and Elena had to decide which set of consequences she could live with. She stepped back from the mirror, away from the boundary between worlds. The other did the same, stepping back into the loft. They faced each other across the impossible divide. Two versions of the same person, each living with the results of choices the other had rejected. "I can't take your life," Elena said, knowing somehow that the other could hear her. "And you can't take mine. We made our choices. We have to live with them." The other nodded slowly. Then she did something unexpected. She picked up a sketchbook from the loft's table and held it up to the mirror. The pages were filled with drawings, beautiful work that took Elena's breath away. The other pointed to the drawings, then to Elena, then to the space around Elena's bedroom, visible through the mirror. The message was clear. You can still create. Your life doesn't have to be either /or. You can find balance. You can paint without becoming me. You can be yourself while incorporating what you value about who I am. Elena felt tears on her face. She nodded, understanding. The other smiled, then gently, with finality, drew a curtain across the mirror on her side. The view of the loft disappeared, replaced by Elena's normal reflection. Elena stood in her bedroom, alone, looking at herself in the antique mirror. She looked the same, tired, worn down by routine, approaching middle age with more regrets than accomplishments. But something had shifted. She'd seen the alternative, understood the costs and benefits of the path not taken, and recognized that she wasn't trapped in her current life. She'd chosen it, and she could choose differently going forward without abandoning everything she'd built. The next morning, Elena called in sick to work. She spent the day cleaning out her closet, finding the art supplies she'd abandoned years ago. The canvases were warped, the paints dried out, but she went to the art store and bought new supplies. Not a huge investment. She couldn't afford to quit her job and pursue art full-time, but enough to start creating again. That evening, she set up a small workspace in the corner of her living room. She positioned an easel where afternoon light fell, arranged her new supplies, and stood before a blank canvas for the first time in 15 years. Her first brushstrokes were tentative, uncertain. Years of not practicing had eroded her confidence and technical skill. But as she worked, muscle memory returned. Her hand remembered how to hold a brush, how to mix colors, how to translate what she saw in her mind onto the physical surface. The painting wasn't good. She could see that objectively. It was amateurish, awkward, the work of someone still finding their way. But it was hers. She'd made it. She'd chosen to create instead of simply existing through another evening of television and routine. Over the following months, Elena rebuilt a relationship with art. Not the all-consuming passion the other had pursued, but a sustainable practice that fit within her existing life. She painted evenings and weekends. She took an online class. She joined a local art group where amateur artists met monthly to share work and encouragement. Her life didn't transform dramatically. She kept her day job, kept her apartment, kept most of her routines. But she'd added something essential that had been missing: the act of creation, the expression of inner life through external medium, the simple satisfaction of making something that hadn't existed before. The mirror continued reflecting her bedroom, showing only the normal reality of the present. Elena never saw the other again, never glimpsed the artist's loft, or the alternative life that might have been. The mirror was just a mirror now, beautiful and antique,
but no longer a doorway to other possibilities. Sometimes, though, when light fell on the mirror at particular angles, Elena thought she caught glimpses of paint-splattered floors, of canvases stacked against walls, of a life lived differently. She didn't know if these were real visions or just her imagination, her mind creating meaning from random reflections. It didn't matter. The other had given her a gift, not the chance to trade lives, but the understanding that life could change. That choices made years ago didn't have to define every moment that followed. That it was never too late to reclaim pieces of yourself you'd set aside, to integrate dreams into reality instead of treating them as mutually exclusive. Elena continued painting. Her work improved slowly, steadily. She had a piece accepted into a local gallery's group show. She sold a few paintings, though not for enough to matter financially. But the sales weren't the point. The point was the creating itself, the restoration of something essential she'd thought was lost forever. Years later, Elena would look at the mirror and remember the night she'd stepped through it, the hours she'd spent in the other's life, the choice she'd made to return. She'd think about the person she could have been and feel neither regret nor longing, just acknowledgement. She'd made different choices, built a different life, and that was all right. The mirror reflected her as she was, older now, with gray streaking her hair and lines around her eyes. But her hands held paintbrushes, her apartment held canvases, and her life held both the security she'd chosen and the creativity she'd reclaimed. Not perfect, but hers. Fully, consciously, deliberately hers. And in the mirror's antique glass, slightly warped by age, her reflection smiled back. Not the tired, worn woman she'd been when she'd bought the mirror, but someone who'd learned to integrate all her selves into one coherent life. All the versions of Elena, all the paths she'd considered, all the choices she'd made and unmade and made again, reflected in a single face that was both familiar and transformed. The mirror kept its secrets. If other lives existed behind its glass, if other versions of Elena lived other choices in parallel rooms, the mirror never revealed them. It had shown her what she needed to see, and that was enough. Story 6. The job posting had been specific. Live-in caretaker for elderly gentleman, private estate, room and board plus salary, minimum 6-month commitment. Joanna Reed applied because she needed the money and didn't mind isolation. At 28, recently divorced and untethered from her previous life, the idea of disappearing into someone else's routine held appeal. The estate was 40 minutes outside of town, accessed by a winding drive through woods that were already gold and red with October color. The house appeared gradually through the trees, a Victorian structure, 3 stories, with a tower at one corner and gingerbread trim that had been painted recently enough to still look fresh. It should have been charming. Instead, it projected an aura of watchful waiting, as though the building itself was aware of her arrival and reserving judgment. The man who answered her knock was not the elderly gentleman she'd come to care for. He was perhaps 60, tall and thin, with silver hair and the kind of posture that suggested military background. Miss Reed, I'm Dr. Howard Lang. I'm Mr. Ashford's physician. Please, come in. The interior was as meticulously maintained as the exterior. Hardwood floors polished to a high shine, furniture that was antique but not decrepit, walls painted in colors that suggested the original Victorian palette. But the house felt empty, in a way that had nothing to do with the number of people occupying it. It felt like a place where life had withdrawn, leaving only the shell. Dr. Lang led her to a sitting room where an elderly man occupied a wheelchair by the window. This was Raymond Ashford, 93 years old, frail as paper, but with eyes that held complete awareness. He studied Joanna for a long moment before speaking. "You'll do," he said finally, his voice stronger than his appearance suggested. "Dr. Lang will explain your duties. The pay is what was advertised. You may have weekends off if you wish, though I suspect you'll find there's nowhere worth going." The duties were straightforward: prepare meals according to a specific diet, assist with bathing and dressing when needed, manage medications, provide companionship. Dr. Lang visited 3 times weekly to monitor Raymond's health. A cleaning service came Thursdays. Otherwise, Joanna would be alone with Raymond in this isolated house. "There's one more thing," Dr. Lang said as he prepared to leave, after showing Joanna to her room on the 2nd floor. "The 3rd floor is off limits. Mr. Ashford is quite firm about this. No one goes up there under any circumstances." Joanna looked at the staircase leading upward from the 2nd floor landing. "What's up there?" "That's not relevant to your position. Simply respect Mr. Ashford's wishes, and there will be no problems." The first week passed uneventfully. Raymond was a demanding but fair employer, particular about routines, but not unreasonable. He ate breakfast at exactly 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. He read for 2 hours after breakfast, napped after lunch, and spent evenings listening to classical music on an old record player. Joanna's role was to facilitate this routine and provide assistance as needed. Raymond rarely spoke beyond what was necessary, but Joanna sensed he was listening to her constant chatter, observations about the weather, stories from her past, questions he never answered. He seemed to appreciate the sound of another voice, even if he didn't acknowledge it directly. The 3rd floor drew Joanna's attention despite her intention to respect Raymond's boundaries. The staircase leading up was visible from her bedroom, the door at its top always closed. She'd catch herself staring at it, wondering what required such absolute prohibition. Valuables, perhaps. Or maybe the space was simply in disrepair, dangerous to enter. Late one night, unable to sleep, Joanna heard sounds from above. Footsteps, slow and heavy, crossing the 3rd floor. She lay in bed, listening, trying to convince herself it was the house, settling or wind-moving loose objects. But the sounds were too regular, too purposeful. Someone was walking up there. In the morning, she mentioned it to Raymond during breakfast. "I heard footsteps last night, from the 3rd floor." Raymond's hand paused halfway to his mouth with a forkful of scrambled eggs. He set the fork down carefully. "Old houses make sounds." These sounded like footsteps, like someone walking. "There is no one on the 3rd floor." Raymond's tone made it clear the subject was closed, but Joanna saw something in his expression, not anger at her questioning, but something closer to fear. The sounds continued nightly, always between midnight and 2 in the morning. Always the same pattern, slow footsteps crossing from one end of the 3rd floor to the other, then silence. Joanna began timing them. They lasted exactly 17 minutes, never varying. She tried to ask Raymond about it again, but he refused to discuss it. Dr. Lang, when she mentioned it during his next visit, gave her a sharp look. "Mr. Ashford has been very clear about the 3rd floor. Your job is to care for him, not investigate the house. I'd suggest you respect that if you want to keep your position. But Joanna's curiosity had become obsession. The sounds haunted her nights. The locked door haunted her days. She found herself standing at the bottom of the third-floor stairs, staring up at the closed door, feeling drawn to it in ways she couldn't explain. In her third week, while Raymond was napping, Joanna climbed the stairs to the third floor. The door was locked as expected, but the key was in the lock on her side. Unusual for a door meant to keep people out. Her hand touched the key, and she felt the same pull she'd been experiencing, the sense that something up there needed her attention. She turned the key. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet house. Joanna pushed the door open and stepped through. The third floor consisted of a single large room that occupied the entire level. Windows on all sides let in afternoon light that illuminated a space frozen in time. The furniture was covered with white sheets, the floor thick with dust that showed no footprints, despite the sounds Joanna had heard nightly. But what dominated the space was the portrait. It hung on the far wall, life-sized, showing a young woman in a wedding dress. She was perhaps 20, beautiful in an old-fashioned way, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to look directly at the viewer. The painting was exceptional, capturing not just physical features, but something deeper. Personality, intelligence, perhaps a hint of sadness. Joanna approached the portrait, drawn to those painted eyes. A small plaque on the frame bore a name and date. Catherine Ashford, 1952. I asked you not to come up here. Joanna spun around to find Raymond in the doorway. He wasn't in his wheelchair. Somehow, he'd climbed the stairs. On legs she'd thought too weak to support him. His face was pale with effort, or emotion. She couldn't tell which. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have... No, you shouldn't have. Raymond moved into the room with slow, painful steps, leaning heavily on the door frame for support. But since you have, I suppose you deserve an explanation. He made his way to a sheet-covered chair and sank into it, breathing hard. Joanna started to help him, but he waved her away. Catherine was my wife, he said, his eyes on the portrait. We married in 1952. She was 21. I was 33. The marriage lasted exactly 3 weeks. Joanna waited, sensing there was more. She fell. Raymond continued. From the tower. The door to the tower room is accessible from this floor. She went up there alone. One evening, I was in town buying supplies. When I returned, I found her body in the garden below the tower. I'm so sorry. The police ruled it accidental. The railing was old, possibly unstable. Catherine had gone up there to watch the sunset. She must have leaned against the railing, and it gave way. Raymond's voice was flat, reciting facts he'd repeated so many times they'd lost emotional weight. But I knew better. I knew she'd jumped. Joanna stared at him. Why would she do that? Because she realized what she'd married, what I am, what I've always been. Raymond looked at Joanna directly for the first time. I'm not a good man, Miss Reed. I've done things, in business, in my personal life, that can't be justified or forgiven. Catherine discovered this quickly. She was perceptive, intelligent. It took her only 2 weeks to understand. The man she'd married was hollow at the center, capable of love only as performance, never as genuine feeling. The room felt colder. Joanna pulled her cardigan tighter. She confronted me the morning of the day she died, said she wanted an annulment,
said she'd made a mistake and needed to correct it before more damage was done. I told her that wasn't acceptable, that we'd made vows, and I expected her to honor them, regardless of her feelings. That marriage was a social contract, and her emotions were irrelevant. Raymond's hands were trembling now. She died 8 hours later, and I've wondered every day since whether she fell or jumped, whether her death was an escape from me or a genuine accident that I've spent decades transforming into something it wasn't. The footsteps, Joanna said quietly. You hear them too. Every night for 68 years, Catherine walking across this floor, going to the tower, making the choice I forced her to make by being what I am. I hear her deciding every single night that death is preferable to life with me. Joanna looked at the portrait again, at Catherine's painted eyes. That's why you won't let anyone up here. You're keeping her contained, keeping her death private. I'm keeping my guilt private. This room is my penance. Every night I lie awake and listen to her walking to her death, and I remember that I'm responsible. Not legally, perhaps, but morally, absolutely. Raymond stood with effort. Now you know. You may leave if you wish. I'll understand if you find this too disturbing to continue working here. But Joanna didn't leave. Something about Raymond's confession, his raw acknowledgement of responsibility, made her want to stay. He wasn't asking for forgiveness or trying to justify what he'd been. He was simply living with the consequences, spending his final years listening to the sound of his failures. She helped him back downstairs and settled him in his wheelchair. Neither of them mentioned the third floor again, but the dynamic between them had shifted. Joanna understood now that she wasn't just caring for an elderly man. She was helping someone serve a sentence of his own design. The footsteps continued nightly, but now Joanna understood what she was hearing. Not a haunting in the traditional sense, but something deeper. Raymond's guilt made manifest, given sound and regularity, ensuring he could never forget or minimize what he'd done to Catherine. One evening, as Joanna was preparing dinner, Raymond spoke from his position by the window. You're wondering if it's real, the ghost. Joanna paused in her chopping. Is it? I don't know. Does it matter? Real ghost or real guilt, the effect is the same. I hear her every night and I remember, and I pay the price. Do you want forgiveness? From whom? Catherine is dead. God, if he exists, has shown no interest in my redemption. I've lived long enough to understand that forgiveness isn't always available, and some things simply have to be endured. Joanna brought him his dinner and sat across from him as he ate. Tell me about her, not about how she died, about who she was. Raymond looked up, surprised. Then, slowly, he began to speak about Catherine's laugh, which had been surprisingly loud for such a small woman, about her love of gardens and her frustration with the rocky soil around the estate, about her intelligence, which had made her seem older than her 21 years, about the way she'd read 3 books a week and filled the margins with notes. It was the first time Joanna had heard him speak with something approaching genuine feeling. The memories were painful for him, but he pushed through the pain, reclaiming his dead wife's personhood from the shadow of her death. Where is she buried? Joanna asked when he'd finished. The town cemetery. I visit monthly. Dr. Lang drives me. May I go with you next time? Raymond studied her for a long moment. Why? Because she deserves to be remembered as more than your guilt. She was a person, and her life mattered beyond how it ended. The next Sunday, Dr. Lang drove them to the cemetery. Raymond's wheelchair managed the paved paths, and Joanna pushed him to a modest headstone that bore Catherine's name and dates. They sat in silence for a while, the October wind moving through the trees around them. Finally, Joanna spoke. "Catherine Ashford, I'm sorry for what happened to you. I'm sorry your life was cut short. I'm sorry you didn't get the chance to become whoever you might have been. Raymond has carried you for 68 years, but I think it's time for both of you to be at peace." Raymond made a sound that might have been a sob, or might have been something else. His hands gripped the wheelchair's armrests, and he bowed his head. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "God help me. I'm sorry." They stayed at the grave for an hour, saying nothing more, just being present with Catherine's memory. When they returned to the estate, Raymond was exhausted, but something in his face had eased. He looked older, frailer, but also somehow lighter. That night, Joanna lay in bed, waiting for the footsteps. Midnight came and passed. 1 a.m., 2. Silence. The footsteps didn't come. She got up and went to Raymond's room, knocking softly. When there was no answer, she opened the door to find him awake, staring at the ceiling with tears on his face. "She's gone," he said. "The footsteps. They've stopped." Joanna sat on the edge of his bed. "Maybe she forgave you. Or maybe you finally forgave yourself. Either way, you're released." Raymond died 6 weeks later, quietly in his sleep. Joanna found him in the morning, lying peacefully in his bed, his face more relaxed than she'd ever seen it. Dr. Lang said it was heart failure, not unexpected at his age. The estate went to a distant nephew who put it immediately up for sale. Joanna helped pack Raymond's personal effects, including the portrait of Catherine, which the nephew donated to the local historical society. On her last day in the house, Joanna climbed to the 3rd floor one final time. The room was empty now, the furniture removed, the portrait gone. Just bare walls and dusty floors and windows that looked out over the autumn landscape. She stood where Catherine's portrait had hung and listened. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. Whatever had bound Catherine to this place, Raymond's guilt, her own unfinished life, the weight of tragedy, had been released. The house was just a house now, ready for new occupants, new stories. Joanna locked the 3rd floor door and left the key in the lock. Whoever bought the estate could deal with that room, could decide whether to preserve it or renovate it or simply leave it sealed. She'd done her part. She'd helped an old man acknowledge his failures and find, if not redemption, at least release. As she drove away from the estate for the last time, Joanna looked in her rear-view mirror at the Victorian house growing smaller behind her. She thought about Catherine, who died too young, about Raymond, who'd lived too long, about guilt and forgiveness, and the ways we haunt ourselves more effectively than any ghost could. The house disappeared behind the trees, and Joanna turned her attention to the road ahead. She'd taken the job for money and ended up with something else, an understanding that the hardest prison to escape is the one we build from our own regrets. Raymond had served his sentence, Catherine had been released from hers, and Joanna carried forward the knowledge that healing sometimes required nothing more complex than acknowledgement, apology, and the willingness to let the dead finally rest. Story 7. The apartment complex was called Riverside Manor, though there was no river nearby and nothing particularly manor-like about the squat brick buildings arranged around a cracked parking lot. Daniel Foster moved into Unit 2B on a Friday in September, hauling boxes up 2 flights of stairs in the early autumn heat, wondering how his life had contracted to the point where this was an upgrade. He was starting over at 36. Divorce, job loss, a series of decisions that had seemed reasonable at the time, but had somehow led him here. A 1-bedroom apartment in a complex that advertised affordable living, in a part of town where affordable was a euphemism for whatever you can manage. The place was clean enough. The landlord had seemed desperate enough for tenants not to ask too many questions, and the rent was within Daniel's reduced budget. That was all that mattered. His neighbors introduced themselves sporadically over the first week. Mrs. Chen in 2A, elderly and quiet, who kept her door chained and spoke through the gap when Daniel tried to say hello. Marcus Washington in 2C, a shift worker whose hours seemed to rotate randomly, creating unpredictable sounds at all times of day and night. The couple in 3B, whose names Daniel never learned, who argued loudly enough that their fights echoed through the thin walls. And the man in 1B, directly below Daniel's unit. Daniel first noticed him during his second week. He'd been carrying groceries up from his car when he saw the man standing on the first-floor landing, apparently waiting for someone. He was perhaps 60, thin to the point of gaunt, with gray hair that needed cutting and clothes that looked slept in. But it was his eyes that caught Daniel's attention, sharp, watchful, with an intensity that was uncomfortable to meet directly. The man nodded at Daniel, a minimal acknowledgement, then turned and went into his apartment. Daniel heard the multiple locks engaging, 5 or 6 distinct clicks suggesting substantial paranoia about security. Over the following weeks, Daniel saw the man regularly, but never spoke to him. The man would be standing on the landing, or checking his mailbox, or taking out trash, always moving with the careful deliberation of someone conserving energy. He never acknowledged Daniel beyond that first nod, and Daniel didn't push for interaction. Everyone in this complex seemed to want privacy. He could respect that. Then Daniel started hearing the sounds from below. It began with scraping, the sound of furniture being moved. Across the floor, heavy and persistent, always late at night. Then came thuds, irregular and forceful, like something heavy being dropped. And finally, voices. Not conversations, but a single voice, male, speaking at length in a tone that was sometimes pleading, sometimes angry, sometimes eerily calm. The man in 1B, clearly. But who was he talking to? The apartment below. Daniel's should be identical in layout. 1 bedroom, 1 bath, living area and kitchen combined. Not much space for anyone to hide, and Daniel had never seen anyone else entering or leaving 1B. He mentioned it to Marcus during a chance encounter in the parking lot. "Oh yeah, that guy." Marcus shook his head. "Been here longer than anyone. 5 years at least. Keeps to himself, which is fine, but he's weird. I've heard him talking too. Always alone, but always talking. Should we be concerned? I mean, is he dangerous?" "Landlord doesn't seem to think so. I asked once, and he said the guy's been a model tenant. Pays rent on time, doesn't bother anyone. Just eccentric." Marcus lowered his voice. "I think he might have mental health issues, talking to himself, the paranoia with all those locks, but as long as he's not hurting anyone." Daniel tried to dismiss his concern, but the sounds continued, nightly, growing more disruptive. The scraping furniture, the heavy thuds, the voice that spoke for hours in the darkness. Daniel's sleep, suffered. He'd lie awake listening to the man below, trying to make out words, wondering what could drive someone to such persistent nocturnal activity. One night, around 2 a.m., the sounds escalated to something new: crying. Deep, wrenching sobs that carried through the floor, raw expressions of grief that made Daniel's chest tighten. He sat up in bed, listening to the man below fall apart, and felt voyeuristic and helpless in equal measure. In the morning, he knocked on 1B's door. The man answered after a long delay, opening the door only as wide as the chain allowed. His face appeared in the gap, eyes red-rimmed and suspicious. "Yes? Hi, I'm Daniel. I live right above you, in 2B. I just wanted to introduce myself properly and see if everything's okay." "Why wouldn't it be?" "I've been hearing sounds at night. I wanted to make sure you weren't in some kind of trouble." The man's expression closed off further. "I'm not making unreasonable noise. This is a cheaply built complex with thin walls and floors. Sound carries. If you're disturbed, perhaps you should request a different unit." "I'm not complaining. I'm asking if you need help." "I don't." The man started to close the door. "Who are you talking to?" Daniel asked quickly. "At night, I hear you talking for hours, but I've never seen anyone else enter your apartment." The man's hand paused on the door. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quality Daniel couldn't quite identify. Defensiveness, maybe, or fear. "That's not your concern. If there's someone in there who needs help, there isn't. Now leave me alone, or I'll contact the landlord about harassment." The door closed with finality, locks engaging one after another. Daniel stood in the hallway, feeling he'd made things worse without understanding how. The sounds continued, but now Daniel felt guilty listening to them, as though he were intruding on something private. Still, he couldn't help hearing them through the thin floor, the furniture scraping, the thuds, the voice speaking at length, the occasional sobbing that broke his heart. He tried complaining to the landlord, carefully avoiding any accusation, just expressing concern. The landlord, a man named Peter Grimshaw, who managed the property from a rented office in town, listened with the weary patience of someone who'd heard it all before. "Mr. Foster, I understand the walls are thin. That's reflected in the rent you're paying. If you want luxury accommodations with soundproofing, you'll need to look elsewhere. As for your neighbor, he's been a tenant here for 7 years, pays on time, causes no problems. Whatever he does in his own apartment is his business, unless it violates the lease, which it doesn't. He might need mental health intervention. Again, unless he's violating lease terms or posing a danger to himself or others, that's not my concern or yours. I suggest you invest in earplugs and respect your neighbor's privacy." Daniel bought earplugs but found he couldn't use them. The sounds from below had become too intriguing, too disturbing to ignore. He'd lie in bed, trying to make out words from the voice below, trying to understand what was happening in 1B that required such persistent, nightly activity. Then one evening, returning from his shift at the warehouse where he'd found work, Daniel saw the man from 1B in the parking lot, loading bags into an old sedan. This was unusual. The man rarely left the building, and Daniel had never seen him with a car before. Daniel approached cautiously. "Going somewhere?" The man looked up, startled, then resigned. "Grocery shopping. Not that it's your business. Look, I'm sorry if I overstepped before. I'm just concerned. The sounds I hear at night..."
are none of your concern. The man closed his trunk with more force than necessary. But then he paused, and something in his expression shifted. You really want to know? I do. The man studied Daniel for a long moment. Come with me. Daniel followed him back into the building, down to 1B. The man unlocked his multiple locks, 7 of them, Daniel counted, and pushed the door open. In, quickly, before anyone sees. Daniel entered, and the man shut the door behind them, engaging all the locks again. The apartment was identical in layout to Daniel's, but decorated very differently. The furniture was minimal, a couch, a small table, a single chair. But the walls were covered, floor to ceiling, with photographs. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Photographs of all sizes, some framed, some taped directly to the wall, creating a collage that covered every surface. And they were all of the same person, a young woman, perhaps 25, with dark hair and a smile that lit up her face. My daughter, the man said quietly. Emily. She died 7 years ago. Car accident. Drunk driver ran a red light. She was 26. Daniel stared at the photographs, understanding beginning to dawn. I'm so sorry. This is my shrine to her. My way of keeping her present. Every night I talk to her. I tell her about my day. I ask her questions. I imagine her responses. I move furniture around, trying to make the apartment feel the way it did when she used to visit. His voice broke. I pretend she's still alive, because the alternative is unbearable. Daniel didn't know what to say. The man, he still didn't know his name, gestured around the apartment. I know it's not healthy. I know I should be moving, on, seeing a therapist, living my life. Everyone tells me that, but I can't. Emily was all I had. Her mother left when she was young. It was just the 2 of us for 24 years. She was my whole world. And now she's gone, and I'm supposed to just accept that? Just move on as though she never existed? No one expects that. Everyone expects that. They give you a few months, maybe a year, and then they start suggesting it's time to pack up the photos, get out more, maybe start dating, as though love has an expiration date, as though grief can be scheduled and concluded on society's timeline. The man moved to the wall and touched one of the photographs gently. Emily sitting on what looked like this apartment's couch, laughing at something off camera. So I stay here, in this cheap apartment where the walls are thin and the neighbors complain, and I keep her alive the only way I can. I talk to her. I remember her. I refuse to let her disappear into the past tense. Daniel looked at the walls of photographs, at this father's desperate attempt to keep his daughter present, and felt his irritation transform into something else. Grief, this deep, deserved respect, not complaint. I won't tell anyone, Daniel said quietly, and I'll stop knocking. Thank you. The man walked to the door, beginning the process of unlocking it. My name is Richard, by the way, Richard Moss. I should have introduced myself when you moved in, but I don't do well with social niceties anymore. Daniel Foster, and I really am sorry about Emily. Richard nodded, and Daniel left, hearing the locks engage behind him. That night, lying in bed, Daniel listened to the sounds from below with new understanding. The voice wasn't delusional rambling. It was a father talking to his lost daughter, maintaining a one-sided conversation because the alternative, silence, acceptance, moving on, was too painful to bear. The sounds continued nightly, but Daniel stopped being disturbed by them. Instead, he found them strangely comforting,
Someone loved so deeply, grieved so completely, that 7 years couldn't diminish the loss. There was something beautiful in that, something that transcended mental health diagnoses or social expectations about healthy grieving. Daniel started listening more carefully, occasionally catching words through the floor. Richard telling Emily about his day, asking her opinion on things, laughing at memories. The conversations had structure, rhythm. Richard had created a relationship with Emily's memory that was as real to him as interactions with living people were to others. One evening, Daniel knocked on 1B's door. Richard answered warily. "I just wanted to say, I understand now, and if there's ever anything you need, I'm right upstairs." Richard's expression softened slightly. "Thank you. That's kind." They didn't become close friends. Richard's life had contracted around Emily's memory, leaving little room for new relationships. But a tentative neighborliness developed. They'd nod when passing in the parking lot. Daniel would occasionally leave groceries by Richard's door when he noticed the older man looked particularly tired. Richard, in turn, left a plate of cookies by Daniel's door. One Christmas with a note. Emily's recipe. She would have wanted to share. Daniel eventually moved to a better apartment across town when his financial situation improved. Before he left, he knocked on 1B one final time. "I'm moving out. I wanted to say goodbye." Richard stood in his doorway, surrounded by his thousands of photographs. "Good luck, Daniel. I hope things improve for you." "They will. They are." Daniel paused. "Keep talking to her. She's lucky to have a father who loves her that much." Richard's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you for understanding. Most people don't." Daniel moved out the next day, and he never saw Richard again. But sometimes, lying in his new apartment with its thick walls and soundproofing, Daniel would think about the man in 1B, still talking to his daughter every night, still refusing to let her disappear into the past. He'd heard the nightly sounds that everyone would call evidence of mental illness or unhealthy coping. But Daniel had learned that grief didn't follow rules, didn't respect timelines, didn't care about society's expectations. Love that's strong didn't just evaporate because someone died. It persisted, transformed, found new ways to express itself. Richard Moss wasn't crazy. He was just a father who loved his daughter beyond the boundaries of life and death, beyond what was considered healthy or normal. And in a world that tried to schedule and sanitize grief, there was something admirable in his refusal to comply, in his insistence that Emily would be remembered, spoken to, kept present for as long as he drew breath. Years later, Daniel would read Richard's obituary in the paper. Heart attack, died in his sleep. The obituary mentioned Emily, survived by. And Daniel knew that Richard had finally joined the daughter he'd been talking to all these years. He hoped they were together now, hoped Richard could finally hear Emily's responses, have the two-way conversation he'd been conducting solo for so long. Hoped that whatever came after death allowed fathers and daughters to reunite, to repair what had been taken too early. And he hoped someone had found Richard's apartment, seen the thousands of photographs, understood what they represented. Not obsession or inability to move on, but love made visible, grief given form, a father's refusal to let his daughter be forgotten. Daniel had learned in that cheap apartment with thin floors that the loudest sounds aren't always the most meaningful, that what appears disturbed might be deeply purposeful. that we should be slower to judge the ways people survive unbearable loss. He'd learned to listen more carefully, and what he'd heard through the floor of apartment 2B wasn't madness. It was love, persistent, devoted, refusing to be silenced by death or time or the judgment of people who'd never experienced loss that absolute. Richard Moss had kept his daughter alive in the only way left to him, and that, Daniel finally understood, wasn't something to complain about. It was something to honor. Story 8. The lighthouse hadn't functioned as a navigational aid since 1978, when the Coast Guard automated the region's warning systems and rendered human keepers obsolete. It stood on a rocky promontory jutting into Lake Superior, 30 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a dirt road that became impassable for half the year. When the Historical Society posted the caretaker position, they received exactly 3 applications. Nina Cortez's was the only one from someone under 60. She arrived in late April, just after the spring thaw, driving a truck loaded with 6 months' worth of supplies. The Historical Society representative who met her at the access road, a IZ retired teacher named Barbara Wheaton, seemed surprised that Nina had actually shown up. Most people take one look at the isolation and change their minds, Barbara said as they drove the final 2 miles to the lighthouse. The last caretaker lasted 3 weeks. The one before that made it through winter but refused to return the following spring. What drove them away? Barbara kept her eyes on the rutted road. The loneliness, mostly. It's profound out here. No cell service, no internet. Just you and the lake and the wind. Some people can't handle that much silence. The lighthouse rose from the rocks like a white finger pointing at the sky, its red cap faded by decades of weather. The keeper's cottage attached to its base was small, but solid. 2 rooms plus a kitchen and bathroom, basic but functional. Solar panels on the roof provided electricity. A rainwater collection system supplemented the well. Nina could survive here comfortably, if not luxuriously. Barbara spent an hour explaining the caretaker duties, maintain the grounds, document any structural issues, give occasional tours to the handful of tourists who made the trek during summer months, file monthly reports. Simple work that left most of each day unstructured, perfect for someone who needed to disappear for a while. After Barbara left, Nina stood on the rocky shore and looked out at the lake. Superior was calm today, almost glassy, but she'd been warned about its moods, how storms could materialize within minutes, how the water could turn violent enough to tear boats apart, how people drowned in these waters regularly, despite knowing better than to underestimate it. She'd come here to be alone. After the breakdown, the hospitalization, the divorce that had followed like an inevitable conclusion, Nina needed distance from her previous life. The lighthouse offered that distance in the most literal sense. Miles from anyone, nothing but water and sky and stone. She could disappear here, could reconstruct herself without witnesses, could learn to live inside her own head again without the constant noise of other people's expectations. The first week passed in peaceful adjustment. Nina established routines. Wake with sunrise, inspect the lighthouse structure, maintain the grounds, read during the afternoon, cook simple meals, sleep when darkness fell. The rhythm was meditative, each day like the one before. Time marked by tasks rather than hours. The silence was profound, not just absence of human voices, but a deeper quiet that came from true isolation.
No traffic sounds, no machinery hum, no distant conversations bleeding through apartment walls. Just wind, waves, and occasionally the cry of gulls. Nina found it soothing rather than oppressive. Her mind, which had been screaming for months, finally began to quiet. She explored the lighthouse thoroughly during those first days. The tower itself rose 80 feet, accessed by a spiral staircase that made her legs burn. The light chamber at the top still held the original Fresnel lens, though it no longer functioned. The view from that height was spectacular. Lake extending to the horizon, the shoreline curving away in both directions. Nothing but wilderness for miles. The keeper's cottage held remnants of previous occupants. Someone had left books on a shelf, maritime history, novels from the 70s, a journal that contained only 3 entries before abandoning the effort. Nina read the entries. They chronicled a keeper from 1952 named Thomas Brennan, who'd written about the peculiar quality of light on the lake, about sounds that seemed to come from the water at night, about feeling watched despite being utterly alone. The last entry was dated 3 weeks after the first. I'm leaving tomorrow. I can't explain what's wrong with this place, but something is. The lighthouse feels occupied, even when I know I'm alone. Last night I heard footsteps in the tower, climbing the stairs. I searched every level and found no one. This morning there were wet footprints on the floor. Boot prints, human-sized, leading from the door to the base of the stairs, and then simply stopping. I'm not staying to discover what made them. Nina closed the journal, unsettled but intrigued. Thomas Brennan had lasted less than a month before the isolation got to him. The Historical Society representative, Barbara, had mentioned previous caretakers leaving quickly. Was this place particularly difficult, or were people simply unused to true solitude? She decided the latter was more likely. Isolation could play tricks on the mind, especially for people unaccustomed to it. The human brain, deprived of external stimulation, began manufacturing its own. Sounds where there was silence, patterns where there was randomness, presence where there was absence. Nina had read about this during her psychiatric hospitalization. Sensory deprivation could induce hallucinations in perfectly mentally healthy people. But Nina wasn't perfectly mentally healthy. She'd been diagnosed with severe depression and anxiety, had spent 2 months in an inpatient facility, had been on medication that made her thoughts feel wrapped in cotton. She was off the medication now, a decision her psychiatrist hadn't endorsed but hadn't been able to prevent, because she wanted to feel things clearly, even if those feelings were painful. The question was whether someone with her history should be living in complete isolation, whether the silence she found so peaceful might eventually become something else, whether her damaged mind would create problems where none existed. She pushed the thought away. She was here. She'd committed to 6 months. She would manage whatever came. The footsteps started in her 3rd week. Nina woke one night to the sound of someone climbing the lighthouse stairs. The sound was unmistakable. Boot heels on metal treads, ascending with steady purpose. She lay in bed, listening, her heart racing, trying to decide what to do. The lighthouse door was locked. She was certain of that. She checked it every night before bed, but someone was in the tower, climbing toward the light chamber. Nina grabbed the flashlight she kept by her bed and moved to the door that connected the cottage to the lighthouse base. She pressed her ear against it and heard the footsteps continuing upward.
maybe halfway up the tower now. Whoever it was wasn't trying to be quiet. She unlocked the door and stepped into the lighthouse base, shining her flashlight up the spiral staircase. The beam illuminated empty metal stairs, curving upward into darkness. The footsteps had stopped. "Hello?" Nina's voice echoed in the tower. No response. She began climbing, her flashlight beam preceding her. The stairs were empty. She checked each level, the old equipment room, the watch room, finally the light chamber at the top. Nothing. No one. The glass walls of the chamber showed only darkness and her own reflection. Nina descended slowly, checking every corner, every shadow. The lighthouse was empty. The door at the base remained locked from the inside, just as she'd left it. No one had entered. No one was here. She returned to bed, but didn't sleep. The footsteps had been real. She'd heard them clearly, counted the rhythm of their ascent, but there was no one in the lighthouse, which meant either someone had been here and escaped impossibly, or she'd heard something that wasn't there. The thought that she might be hallucinating terrified her more than any intruder could. Hallucinations meant her mental illness was worsening, meant she shouldn't be here alone, meant the breakdown might be recurring. In the morning, she searched for rational explanations. Sounds carried strangely in the tower. Maybe wind had created acoustic effects that sounded like footsteps. Maybe the metal stairs expanded or contracted with temperature changes, making sounds she'd interpreted as footsteps. Maybe she'd been dreaming and hadn't realized it. None of these explanations felt adequate, but she clung to them anyway. The alternative, that she was experiencing auditory hallucinations, was unacceptable. The footsteps came again 2 nights later. Same pattern, same steady ascent up the tower stairs. This time, Nina didn't investigate. She lay in bed, listening until the sounds stopped, then forced herself to sleep. By the 4th occurrence, she'd accepted that the footsteps were a regular phenomenon. They came every few nights, always between midnight and 3 a.m., always following the same route up the stairs. Nina began documenting them, time, duration, any variations in the pattern. She told herself she was being scientific, gathering data, but really she was trying to control something that frightened her. Other sounds joined the footsteps, doors opening and closing in empty rooms, the creak of floorboards under no visible weight. Once, she heard what sounded like someone working in the equipment room, tools being moved, metal scraping on metal, a man's voice muttering words she couldn't make out. Nina searched the lighthouse after each occurrence and found nothing. No evidence of intrusion, no signs that anyone but her had been here. The rational explanations began to feel inadequate. These weren't random creaks or acoustic anomalies. These were purposeful sounds, human sounds, sounds that suggested presence. She considered leaving. She'd been here 2 months, had fulfilled 1/3 of her commitment, could claim the isolation was too difficult and return to civilization. But something stopped her. Partly pride. She'd told everyone she could handle this. Partly stubbornness. She refused to be driven away by sounds that might not even be real. And partly something else. A growing sense that whatever was making these sounds wasn't hostile. The presence felt watchful, but not threatening, as though something was going about its business parallel to hers, occupying the same space, but not interfering with her. She started talking to it, felt foolish doing so. But she was alone, and no one would know. "I hear you," she'd say when the footsteps climbed the tower. "I know you're here. I'm not going to hurt you. And I hope you're not going to hurt me. We can share this space." The sounds continued, but they no longer frightened her as much. Nina began to think of the presence as a previous keeper, someone who'd loved the lighthouse so much they'd stayed after death. Thomas Brennan, perhaps, despite his journal entry about leaving. Or someone from an earlier era, before records were kept carefully. She researched the lighthouse's history using the limited resources available in the keeper's cottage. Old logbooks, historical documents the society had provided. She learned that 4 keepers had died while stationed here over the lighthouse's century of operation. 2 from illness, 1 from a fall, 1 from drowning after his boat capsized in a storm. The drowning victim was named Michael Cavanaugh. He'd been keeper from 1923 to 1937, longer than anyone else. According to the records, he'd been devoted to his duties, maintaining the light with obsessive care, rarely taking time away from the station. He'd died trying to rescue a fishing boat in distress during a November gale. His body had washed ashore 3 days later at the base of the lighthouse. Nina wondered if Michael's spirit had remained, still keeping watch over the lighthouse he'd tended for 14 years. The thought was less disturbing than she'd expected. If she had to share the lighthouse with a ghost, Michael Cavanaugh seemed like good company, dedicated, responsible, apparently content to go about his routines without bothering her. The phenomenon escalated in her 4th month. Nina woke one night to find wet footprints on the cottage floor. Boot prints, just as Thomas Brennan had described in his journal. They led from the door to the lighthouse base, then stopped, as though whoever made them had simply vanished. Nina's hand trembled as she photographed the prints with her phone. This was physical evidence, not sounds that might be explained away, but actual marks that proved something had been here. Something that left wet prints despite no rain, no water source, no logical explanation. She touched one of the prints. The water was cold, lake cold, and had a faint smell of algae and deep water. These weren't prints from a living person. They were too cold, too strange, too impossible. The next morning, Nina hiked to the highest point on the promontory, where her phone could sometimes catch a signal. She called Barbara Wheaton. The other caretakers who left quickly. What did they report? What drove them away? Barbara was quiet for a moment. Unusual experiences, sounds mostly. Some reported seeing things. One claimed she'd encountered a man in old-fashioned keeper's clothing who disappeared when she approached. The Historical Society's position is that isolation creates these experiences, that people unaccustomed to being alone begin to hallucinate or misinterpret sensory data. What's your position? Off the record, I think the lighthouse is haunted. I think Michael Cavanaugh never left. I think he's still here, still keeping watch, and some people can sense his presence more strongly than others. You believe in ghosts. I believe in things I can't explain, and I've heard too many consistent reports from different caretakers to dismiss them all as hallucination. Something is there, whether it's a ghost in the traditional sense or some other phenomenon, I don't know. After the call, Nina sat on the rocks and thought about what Barbara had said. She'd come here to escape her own mind, to find peace in isolation. Instead, she'd found company. Unwanted, unexplained, but strangely not unpleasant. She returned to the lighthouse and stood in the base of the tower.
"Michael Kavanaugh," she said to the empty air. "If that's who you are, I want you to know I'm not trying to take your place. I'm just here temporarily. I'll maintain the lighthouse the best I can, and when my time is done, I'll leave. But while I'm here, I'd appreciate it if you could make your presence a little less alarming. I have enough trouble with my own mind without worrying about yours." That night, the footsteps came again, but they sounded different, slower, more careful, as though whoever was climbing was trying not to disturb her. The sound was almost apologetic. Nina smiled in the darkness. "Thank you," she whispered. Over the remaining months of her stay, Nina developed a relationship with the presence. She'd talk to it while working, explaining what she was doing, why certain maintenance was necessary. She'd leave coffee in the equipment room sometimes, though it was never drunk. She'd say goodnight when she went to bed, and the footsteps that night would be quieter, more distant. The wet footprints appeared occasionally, always the same pattern, from the door to the base of the stairs. Nina stopped being frightened by them. They were just Michael's way of making his rounds, checking on the lighthouse he'd died protecting. Sometimes, when she was in the light chamber at sunset, she'd feel a presence beside her, not threatening, just companionable, as though someone else was appreciating the view. She'd talk to the presence then, telling it about her life, her breakdown, her recovery. She found it easier to be honest with a ghost than she'd ever been with the living. "I was drowning too," she told the presence one evening as the sun set over the lake. "Not in water like you, but in my own head. Everything felt too heavy, too painful, too impossible. I couldn't see a way forward. That's why I'm here, to learn to breathe again." The presence felt closer, attentive. Nina continued, "The thing is, I'm starting to heal. Being alone, it's not easy, but it's teaching me that I can survive myself, that I don't need constant distraction or validation or someone else to make me feel real. I can just be, and that's enough." She felt acknowledgement from the presence, as though it understood, as though Michael Kavanaugh, who'd spent 14 years in isolation at this lighthouse, knew exactly what she meant. Nina's 6-month commitment ended in October. Barbara drove out to collect her, and Nina packed her truck with the few belongings she'd brought. Before leaving, she climbed the tower one final time and stood in the light chamber. "I'm going now," she said to the air. "Thank you for sharing this place with me. Thank you for teaching me that solitude doesn't have to mean loneliness. So I hope you find peace, whatever that means for you." She felt the presence clearly then, stronger than ever before, and for just a moment she saw him. A man in old-fashioned keeper's clothing, standing by the window, looking out at the lake. He turned to face her, and his expression was peaceful, content. He nodded once, a gesture of farewell and acknowledgement. Then he faded, and Nina was alone in the chamber. She descended the stairs for the last time and locked the lighthouse door behind her. Barbara was waiting by the truck. "How was it?" Barbara asked. "Lonely," Nina said, "but in a good way. I needed to learn to be alone with myself. The lighthouse gave me that." "Did you experience anything unusual?" Nina smiled. "Just the usual sounds old buildings make. Nothing worth reporting." She drove away from the lighthouse, watching it shrink in her rearview mirror. She'd gone there broken and frightened, unsure if she could survive her own mind. She left with something she'd been missing, an understanding that solitude and loneliness weren't the same thing. that you could be alone without being abandoned, that sometimes the company of the dead was less complicated than the company of the living. Michael Cavanaugh had been a good companion, a quiet presence that asked nothing, judged nothing, just existed alongside her while she learned to exist alongside herself. She hoped he was still there, still keeping watch over his lighthouse, still protecting the rocky shore where he'd died. And she hoped future caretakers would be kind to him, would recognize his presence not as something to fear, but as evidence that devotion could transcend death, that some spirits stayed not because they were trapped, but because they'd found a place worth keeping. Nina returned to her life changed, not cured. Mental illness didn't work that way, but stronger, more capable, better equipped to manage the difficult terrain of her own consciousness. She'd learned to exist with ghosts, both literal and metaphorical, and that knowledge would serve her well. The lighthouse stood on its promontory, red cap bright against the gray sky, keeper gone, but not abandoned. And inside, if you listened carefully, you might still hear footsteps climbing the tower stairs, a devoted keeper making his eternal rounds, watching over a coast he'd loved enough to die protecting and loved too much to ever leave. Story 9. The university archive occupied the basement of the oldest building on campus, a brick structure from 1889 that had served various purposes over the decades. Library, administrative offices, dormitory during a brief experimental period that ended badly. Now it housed forgotten records and a single archivist whose job was to maintain documents no one ever requested. That archivist was Olivia Park, and she'd held the position for 3 months when she found the diary. It had been misfiled, or more accurately, deliberately hidden, behind a row of bound volumes containing alumni records from the 1920s. The diary was small, leather-bound, with a lock that had rusted open decades ago. No name on the cover, no identifying information. Just the diary itself, its pages yellowed and brittle. Olivia opened it carefully, intending to determine where it belonged in the cataloging system. The first entry was dated September 15th, 1923, written in neat, feminine handwriting. I've begun my studies at Westfield. The campus is beautiful, though the other girls seem to find me odd. I suppose I am odd. I see things they don't. Father says it's a gift, but it feels like a curse. The dead are everywhere here. Olivia felt a chill despite the archive's stuffy warmth. She flipped ahead, scanning entries. The diary belonged to someone named Catherine Hale, a freshman who'd arrived at Westfield University in 1923. Each entry described Catherine's experiences seeing ghosts on campus, students who'd died decades earlier but remained, professors who'd passed but still attended classes, staff who'd died and continued their duties. The entries grew more disturbed as they progressed. Catherine described how the ghosts would watch her, recognizing her ability to perceive them, how they'd try to communicate, seeking help or simply acknowledgement, how the boundary between the living and dead felt thin here, as though the university existed in multiple times simultaneously. The final entry was dated November 3rd, 1923. They've become too insistent. Every room I enter feels crowded, as if I'm walking into a gathering that has been waiting for me. They press close, faces turned up, mouths moving all at once. I can't separate one voice from another. I can't even tell where the sound begins anymore, only that it's always there. I can't sleep.
When I close my eyes, the voices don't fade. They loosen into a shapeless murmur, like wind moving through a long, empty hall. I can't study either. A single sentence won't stay in my mind long enough to mean anything. The dead keep slipping into the spaces where my thoughts should be. Today I tried to tell someone. I rehearsed the words first, carefully, as if precision could keep me safe. But the moment I spoke, I saw that look, the gentle concern that is worse than disbelief. They hear hysteria, where I mean truth. The dean suggested I withdraw from my studies. He said it kindly, like a remedy. Perhaps he's right. Perhaps some people aren't meant to see what I see. I'm leaving tomorrow. I want to believe distance will help. But I suspect the dead exist everywhere. I suspect they aren't bound to buildings the way the living are. And I suspect I'll never truly escape them. Olivia closed the diary with both hands, as if the cover could keep the words from spilling into the air. Her fingers trembled. She told herself it was the cold of the basement archive, the stale dust, the late hour. But it felt like something deeper, recognition. She went straight to the alumni files, expecting, hoping, to find Catherine Hale neatly recorded somewhere. A name, a date, proof that the diary belonged to an ordinary student who simply frightened herself with imagination. There was no record at all. No Catherine Hale. No graduation. No transfer. No notice. Only the diary, hidden in the archives as though it had been meant to wait. Olivia should have cataloged it and returned to her work. That was the responsible choice. But Catherine's words kept echoing, because Olivia had been uneasy since taking this job. Certain aisles always seemed colder. Sometimes she caught movement in her peripheral vision, just a shift, a suggestion, only to find nothing when she turned. Once, alone, late at night, she thought she heard whispering, faint and urgent, that stopped the instant she looked up. She'd blamed stress, long hours, her old anxiety, the strange effect of working underground. But what if Catherine hadn't been imagining anything? The thought terrified Olivia, yet it drew her in. She decided to test it. Only once, she told herself. Enough to prove it was nothing. She visited the locations Catherine had written about most. The third floor of the North Dormitory, the basement of the Science Building, the old library reading room, where Catherine claimed the tables were never truly empty. Olivia went after hours, when campus quieted and the buildings felt like they were listening. She stood in hallways and waited. She sat in empty rooms and tried to soften her attention the way Catherine described, without forcing, without staring, letting the mind loosen its grip on the present. At first, nothing happened. She felt foolish, like someone daring a story to become real. Then, in the old library reading room, she saw her. Just a moment. A girl at the far end of the table, dressed in the clean lines of the 1920s, bent over an open book. The sight was so ordinary, it took Olivia a second to understand how impossible it was. Olivia blinked. The girl was gone. But the chair she'd been sitting in still rocked gently, as if the room hadn't decided which time it belonged to. Olivia returned to the archive with her heart racing. She read Catherine's diary again, slower this time. Catherine hadn't only recorded sightings. She'd written about learning, how to distinguish the living from the dead, how to manage the constant presence, how to keep from being overwhelmed. Olivia tried Catherine's methods more seriously. She sat in the same places, breathing slowly, letting her perception widen. And gradually, she began to see them. Not always, not clearly,
but often enough to know it wasn't imagination. Students from different decades drifting through familiar halls. A professor standing at a chalkboard in an empty room, continuing a lecture no one could hear. A janitor moving through the science building basement, cleaning with the steady patience of habit. The university was haunted, not with rage, not with malice, but with routine. It felt less like a horror story and more like a crowded place where the living only noticed their own kind. Olivia started keeping her own notes, a private diary tucked away in her desk. She documented the girl in the library who read the same book each night, the professor who prepared lectures for students who never arrived, the janitor who cleaned rooms that had been renovated decades after he died. Once, she tried to speak about it to a colleague. The reaction was immediate and familiar. Concern, gentle questions, suggestions of stress, a soft recommendation that she take time off. Olivia heard in that careful kindness the same dismissal Catherine had described. So Olivia stopped talking. Outwardly, she became normal again. Inwardly, she continued learning. She also learned something else. The ghosts were aware of her. When she noticed them, some would pause, some would watch. A few drifted closer, as if drawn to the strange novelty of being seen. One evening, working late in the archive, Olivia sensed a presence behind her. Clearer than the others, deliberate. She turned. A young woman stood near the filing cabinets. 1920s dress, dark hair, an expression that felt intensely alive. "Catherine?" Olivia whispered. The woman tilted her head, studying her. Then, in a voice so faint it sounded like it had traveled a long way to reach the room, she said, "You can see me." "I can," Olivia managed. "I found your diary." Catherine stepped closer, her outline sharpening. "I died here," she said simply. "I didn't withdraw. 2 days after my last entry, I went to the clock tower. I thought height would bring silence. I thought I could escape the layers." Olivia felt tears rise. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be," Catherine said without bitterness. "I understand it now." "Why are you still here?" Olivia asked. Catherine's mouth softened into something like a small smile. "I was waiting for someone who could see me and understand what I saw. I waited for you to find the diary and to learn." Olivia's breath shuddered out. "So this isn't mental illness?" Catherine finished gently. "No, not that. The university exists across multiple times at once, past and present layered together. Most people walk through only one layer. A few can perceive the overlap." Over the weeks that followed, Catherine taught Olivia how to live with it, how to strengthen perception without drowning in it, how to hear a single voice without being crushed by many, how to recognize echoes from spirits who were aware. Olivia learned, slowly, that the dead here weren't monsters. They were people, caught in routines, clinging to familiar paths, repeating the shape of their lives in the places that had held them most strongly. She kept working in the archive. She kept documenting, not only official history, but the hidden one. The quiet population moving through the same rooms, the way time stacked itself like thin sheets of glass. Years later, Olivia would still be there, archivist by title, witness by necessity. Sometimes she could help a spirit find calm. Sometimes she could only write them down so they weren't erased. Catherine faded eventually, her purpose complete. Before she did, she left Olivia with one last thought, spoken like a blessing. "The ability to see ghosts," Catherine said, "is also the ability to truly see people. to remember that every life matters, even after it ends. Use it well. Olivia did. In the quiet basement, surrounded by records of the past, she found a strange peace. Above her, the university thrived with students who didn't know how many footsteps overlapped their own. And below, Olivia kept writing, preserving the living and the dead, the present and the past, so that no one, not even the forgotten, vanished completely. And that brings us to the end of tonight's collection. 9 stories about the things we carry: guilt, grief, memory, and the weight of the past that refuses to stay buried. I hope these tales gave you something to think about as you drift off, that peculiar comfort that comes from knowing darkness has been acknowledged and survived. Thank you for spending these hours with me, for letting these stories settle into your thoughts as sleep approaches. I'll be back soon with more tales from the dark and strange places where the rain falls and the past whispers. Until then, sleep well. And remember, some hauntings are just memories wearing different faces, and some memories are hauntings we choose to keep. Good night.